Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Edelgard of the Rebellion in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 6, Abyssal Depths. The first thing Edelgard noticed was how soft her bed was. It was like she was laying on clouds, the way her bed was at home, but slightly different. Her stepfather was a believer in the idea that a soft bed made a weak person, but all it took was a little begging and she ended up with a mattress that felt like she could sink into. And although Edelgard had gotten used to sleeping in less comfortable places, anything at all was better than the cold concrete she had grown accustomed to during the experiments. She remembered laying there, the floor cold as ice, desperately trying to make the shivers go away. In those days she would fall asleep to the deafening sound of silence, and once in a while the occasional scream that no amount of sound dampeners could muffle. So in other words, she was definitely not dead or captured. It took quite a bit of effort, but she forced her eyes to open. The fluorescent light was still blinding, but she appreciated the fact that it was clearly dimmed a good amount. She barely had enough strength to crane her neck as she tried to take a good look at her surroundings. Edelgard was stuck in some sort of clinic. Mercedes's clinic? Oh, so you're awake already? The voice moved toward her, and she recognized the unmistakable form of Mercedes von Martritz. Her luscious blonde hair fell to her right side, and her calm expression made Edelgard's heart slow down a tiny bit. Everything would be okay. Mercedes von Martritz. The youngest ever recipient of a doctorate from Newfoundland's premier medical school, at the age of 22. A genius by all standards, whose research advanced the medical field by half a decade, and also the kindest woman Edelgard ever knew. So kind, in fact, that she gave up all of her titles and job offers to open a clinic inside Abyss to help those who needed it. And it was Mercedes's clinic that saved many a life of a dying mercenary or a foolhardy enforcer alike, snatching them from the jaws of death through special herbal treatments and precise cuts. She knew her craft well, and chose her surgeries carefully. Edelgard did not know why Mercedes chose the road less traveled, ditching a life of privilege for one in the darkness of Abyss. It was a hard one, and a much more selfless one, but despite the near sainthood of her friend Edelgard still suspected she had a much less altruistic reason. The way she asked about Edelgard's missions, the way that she looked at her, it was as if she was desperately searching for something, or maybe even someone. Edelgard shot up. Her left arm was plugged into an 4, and she found herself in some more casual clothes. Mercedes took off my armor. She flushed. She didn't like when people got near her like that. Even if it was Mercedes, who knew many of her secrets because it was impossible to lie to her physician. Regardless of what she did or what injuries she received, it was always Mercedes who mended her broken bones, stitched her up and put her back together again. And though her ragtag team of mercenaries and idiots had some medics among them, none were on par with just how good Mercedes was. Hey, let's relax, Edie. She felt a hand close to her chest steady here, so that she didn't move too forward too quickly. It was light, but firm enough to give her a moment's pause. It's all right. You're safe here. Edelgard rubbed her eyes. How long was I out? Oh, only a few hours. Still long enough to give poor old me a heart attack, though. Shit. Bernadetta was supposed to receive a status report. No doubt she's freaking out right now. So, crooned Mercedes, are you gonna tell me why your bike flew you in half dead, unconscious as you flapped your limbs like an idiot? I crashed. Sure, sweetie. And I'm the God Emperor. Be honest, will you? Edelgard sighed. I ran into the Death Knight. Instantly Mercedes snapped forward. She lightly grabbed Edelgard and leaned into her makeshift hospital bed, getting so close that Edelgard merely turned red. Her eyes were wide, both with concern and the sense that she desperately needed to know. It was a face of desperation, and it was one that she had never seen before. What happened? Merci, relax. What the hell dash? Tell me. Her grip tightened. Please. Edelgard sighed. Ran into him on my way here. So it's true, she muttered. It wasn't just a bunch of rumors after all. Yeah. Gave me that. She tried to point to her wound, and winced at the strain. Did you see his face? No. Anything. Mercedes, are you trying to knock me out again with all of these questions? That took the wind right out of Mercedes's sails, and she let go of Edelgard's wrist. She was sitting in a rolling chair, with a hollow screen in her hands carefully monitoring Edelgard's vitals. It was a strange feeling looking through it and seeing her entire life reduced to a moving graph and a series of numbers. The blue in Mercedes's eyes wouldn't meet her gaze. "Mercedes. Do you know who the Death Knight is?" She sighed, her lab coat flopping around as she put her arms down. "I had my suspicions that someone I cared about had been lurking in Abyss. I didn't know you were Dash." No," said Mercedes, and there was a hint of embarrassment in her voice. "It's really not like that at all. I just made a promise, that's all." "And you think he's the Death Knight?" "I wouldn't put it past him." "Ugh. Another mystery to add to the pile." Her personal physician, the Saint of the Abyss, was looking for a mysterious person in her life who may or may not be the infamous killer known as the Death Knight. She made a mental note to look into Mercedes's past, and though she disliked spying on her friends and prying into their personal traumas, it was a necessary evil. What was hiding beneath the facade of Mercedes von Martritz? Frustrated, Mercedes put down her screen and looked at Edelgard. "So," she said, "let's move on to the matter of your injury." Edelgard snuck a glance at her wound. Though she couldn't see much of it from her clothes, she lifted up part of her shirt to see that her left side was bloodied and covered in antiseptic bandages. Some sort of rapidly acting serum had been sprayed onto it, because it felt squishy to the touch. To Mercedes's credit, she didn't feel anything, other than a lingering sense of exhaustion and a chill in her bones. She sure knew how to treat a delicate flower. It was much worse than she remembered. If she hadn't gotten here in time. The wound was quite deep, unfortunately. Cut through your side pretty damn well, only nicked a couple organs. It was a heated blade, I'm assuming. She didn't even wait for a reply before she continued. Burned through a bit of tissue. Your regeneration made it a lot better than it should have been. Otherwise you probably would have died long ago from blood loss. The nature of her augmentations still did not make sense. She flinched as she remembered the cold touch of the scalpel, the constant IVs in her arm, the unnatural way her blood pulsed beneath her skin, the fact that something was pumping through her body and it most definitely wasn't blood. The doctors would pry at her skin, the blinding light over her head searing into her eyes as mechanical fingertips pried her eyelids open, and she did not want to recall anymore. If it wasn't for Mercedes. Mercedes had been taking care of her for years, ever since she found a half-dead and delirious Edelgard in the streets of Inver district, muttering about a dead brother and how the magistrate had taken everything. She had nursed the poor little girl back to health, and Edelgard swore a life debt to her in exchange. How could she ever repay her? Though each and every night she cried for home and to see her family again, she could only sleep with the reassuring warmth of her savior at her side. It was almost like she had a big sister. Mercedes was in charge of helping her come to terms with her augmentations, or at least the changes she had to make. In those days the side effects were quite problematic, and she often found herself losing control. She dimly remembered a memory of when she first gripped a mug in her hand, and shattered it from simply picking it up. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." Mercedes simply swept the shards up with a broom, eventually kneeling in front of a crying girl who had lost everything. "We all lose control sometimes," she had said. "We just sometimes forget our own strength. And you are the strongest person I know." She lived in a world of cardboard, constantly needing to hold back. Each time she pushed her limits, she found that she wasn't really sure where her limits were. As she kicked away cars and dodged explosions faster than any normal human could react to, Edelgard barely recognized what she had become. Her muscles were toned and denser than she remembered, and something was wrong with her eyes. They saw too clearly, tracking each and every movement with ease. She would sometimes move on instinct, dodging an eraser thrown at her or the telltale swish of a knife being thrown. It was odd, getting used to a body that she did not recognize. And she still did not know why they had chosen her, of all people, to be their unwilling test subject. In part, that was why she was fighting against the Empire. She wanted answers for the tragedy of Hresvelg and people to answer for them. "At any rate," said Mercedes, and that snapped her back to reality, "you're healing quite well. Have there been any side effects of your augs recently?" Uh, not really. That was a blatant lie, and one that she did not want to go into right now. She raised an eyebrow and said nothing. And Edelgard, how have you been? Merci, it's only been 2 weeks since I last saw you. Come on, she crooned. I know there's something bothering you. How did she even begin to explain what had happened? There was an awkward silence between the two of them as she struggled to keep herself composed. But this was Mercedes, and she knew that the closest thing she had to an older sister would hear her out. Even if she was sounding a little crazy. There are these dreams, she confessed. Dreams of a different world. Oh, Edel, sounds quite interesting. But you wouldn't tell me this if all it was just dreams, It's like, memories, almost. Of a different me. Of a different time. Of a different you. I don't know. But you know something. No, how could she even begin to explain this? About the girl in the tank, about the strange feelings of déjà vu and the creeping sense of familiarity that she had when looking at certain things. That her last dream felt more real than the world she lived in, and that she could no longer discern what was her memory and what was another set of memories that merely resided inside of her own head. And, she thought, who was the woman that she loved so desperately that she would do anything for? All she could remember was a single face, and yet she loved it so. Edelgard shook her head, her hair bun coming slightly undone as strands of platinum fell around her shoulders. Forget about it for now. Mercedes sighed. Tell me about it later, then. Pinky promise. She stuck out her pinky. Edelgard could only roll her eyes as she held out her hand in an outstretched pinky finger, and the two locked their hands together for one brief moment. And that was the end of that line of questioning. Ahem. Mercedes coughed. Forgive me being airheaded. I just got carried away, that's all. So, I did a scan of your body, and it seems that your injuries are healing nicely. Your blood results are inconclusive, however, and as a result, her voice droned on, and it was back to business as usual. She was back to Mercedes, the saint of Abyss, savior of the sick and wounded, and Edelgard could do nothing but nod and smile. It was like old times, as if she was still a broken child, searching desperately for a meaning in life, while Mercedes held her tight and whispered assurances. Only she could fret like a doting mother, and so after every nook and cranny of Edelgard's body had been checked for signs of scarring, she was back to being a free woman. She bid goodbye to Mercedes's clinic and stepped outside. Although it wasn't really outside, it was a little different, as in the guise of a wandering sellsword she stepped into the streets of the Undercity. It went by many names. Undercity. Abyss District. Sin City. The most accurate name was probably Undercity, because it was quite literally under the center of the city. It was a massive cavern, probably stretching 100 meters high and a decent amount of kilometers in square footage. Though the bedrock of Newfoundland was quite tough by any standards, to make sure that no unfortunate seismic events could destroy the Undercity, the ceiling was resurfaced with metal sheets and reinforced steel beams into a makeshift dome. Massive floodlights dotted the ceiling, specially designed to provide as close to an analog to the sun as possible. It even dimmed slightly during the night hours so as to not disrupt the human body's natural circadian rhythm. Next to those floodlights were massive vents, heavily filtered to let fresh air in and out of the city. These were larger versions of the ventilation used in the tunnels throughout the rest of Abyss, exchanging musty air for fresh air in specially designed ventilation towers. The end result was a steel sky, lit by ingenuity and the hard work of those who had come before. Though requests had been made to layer the Undercity, most of those attempts failed due to general concern of putting too much weight on the structure. There was a single layer of cobblestone above the bedrock, and this served mostly as the floor of Abyss District. And once you looked away from the ceiling, it almost looked like a strangely ancient town. Like its above-ground counterparts, the streets were well paved and well lit with people enjoying their time outside. Although there were noticeably less people, it still was a lively district of Newfoundland. In the old days, Abyss might have been considered something of a secret. The tunnels of Abyss surely had theirs, but to most people of Newfoundland the district of Abyss was simply a wretched hive of villainy and scum. It was really the entertainment district, where people indulged their vices after a long day of work. If you wanted to gamble your life savings away, you could do so in the Zoltan Casino, where technology only made it easier to keep going until bankruptcy. If you wanted to procure certain illegal substances, then the Undercity was where you went to get it under the table. And of course, if you desired the gentle touch of another, then one of the brothels here was a safe way to do so. As a result, the district enjoyed a wide variety of people and customers, and commanded quite the interesting reputation in the empire. The Undercity was allowed to exist merely because it hid the vices of Newfoundland in a place where it could be monitored and regulated. To ban having a good time would be a waste of effort, simply because it would spark a revolution. And it would no doubt allow places to spring up around the city, forcing the sex worker and gambling industries underground and give gangs a foothold like they did before the Unification War. The solution was genius: use Abyss District to centralize all of that, and also hide it from the eyes of the people. It wasn't hard to find if you went looking, but if you weren't looking then it might as well have never existed at all. The end result was a city that had been created purely for the pleasures of the flesh and mind. It was also interesting that almost nobody lived in Abyss, save for those who were crazy enough to brave the darkness. Though there were quite a few hotels, and shady motels, they rarely held anyone for an extended amount of time. Actual residences were few and far between. The reasoning was that real estate was still relatively expensive even in the absence of light, and few people would want to live without the warmth of the sun. And even those who were less fortunate would rather pay a premium and live on the outskirts of the city than rot in the underground. This made the Abyss District a hub of sorts, where people from all walks of life joined together in drunken revelry and chicanery. The main entrances on all four cardinal directions were heavily guarded by Imperial enforcers, connecting to the outside world through a mix of elevators, escalators, and some gently sloping tunnels. A light rail connected the city to the outside world, though it was much slower than the modern maglev rail topside. But the city was small enough to walk around in several hours, and so aside from a few supply roads there was little to no traffic. But for those skirting on the wrong side of the law, Abyss had quite a few secrets. The most closely guarded were the hidden exits, connected to the city through tunnels and basements alike. These were often used by mercenaries, who often laid low here after a job to let it all blow over. Though Edelgard had watched many movies about gang life and mafia in the cities of old, Newfoundland was instead run by mercs. Each mercenary group had their own moral code, their own sense of brotherhood, and their own purpose for fighting. Though Abyss was technically neutral ground for all of them, that still didn't stop the occasional bar fight between groups breaking out. After all, mercenaries were quite the rowdy bunch. The Blade Breakers were most certainly rowdy. Edelgard dimly wondered if the theory that Abyss was once a giant bomb shelter might be true. Still, that would probably be at the bottom of her list of things worth investigating. As she passed through the streets of the Undercity with her mercenary outfit on, she couldn't help but notice some people that caught her eye. There was a man, larger than anybody she had ever seen, who towered over people. His bicep was larger than her waist, and at the end of his left hand was some sort of energy-blasting apparatus. Near him was a beautiful and scantily clad girl, hitting a man for presumably trying to leave before paying. There were a few familiar faces here and there, as she passed by a girl with pink hair that she sort of remembered. Where had she seen her before? She only stopped looking when she got to the door of Leclerc's. She heard it before she saw it, laughter and the sound of very loud people having a good time. The telltale sound of glass clinking on wood, dance music blasting in the background. It was a lively night in Leclerc's. This bar was the preferred place of choice for many of Newfoundland's mercenaries, partly because of the seemingly boundless supply of alcohol and partly because they wanted to see the bartender. Edelgard gingerly opened the first door and saw a mountain of a man standing beside the entrance. Balthus, as she knew him by, was absolutely massive by any standards. Rumor had it that he was the former king of grappling, and with his physique she was inclined to believe it. He was dressed in a formal suit, except for the part that his neckline plunged down deep enough to show his massive pectorals. His long hair and bulging muscles probably scared most people, and it was only his friendly personality that kept people from freaking out. Still, he was probably the main deterrent in making sure that fights didn't break out. And in the rare event that they did, it only took a few moments of Balthus walking menacingly to stop any conflict from happening. "Hello, Balthus," she said. "How's the night?" "Hey pal, good to see ya," he said, grabbing her hand and shaking it. "Bit packed in there, so if you want to talk I suggest being quick." "Gotcha. The crisp bill that had been in her palm left with Balthus's hand, and he slipped it into his pocket. "Pleasure seein' ya." She gave him a curt nod, and stepped in. Leclerc's was a modern bar with the rustic feel of a tavern of old. As soon as she walked in she could see the large bar on her left, filled with people struggling to get the attention of the bartender. The wood tables and chairs scattered gave the feeling of an old western saloon, but the glass countertop near the bar was much more modern. LEDs lit up the bar with strange colors, adjusting to the beat of the dance music that played loud enough to hear but not enough to drown out the conversation. And in the back was a dance floor where the music was ear-splittingly loud, and where people danced until the bar shut down or they found someone to go home with that night. Behind the bar, large tanks of drinks created a wall of different brands of alcohol. Each was connected using a piping system to various taps distributed around the countertop, and each one was manned by a bartender. Though by this century machines could easily mix drinks and have them come out perfect, they lacked the flair that a human bartender had. So, as usual, Leclerc's had some very attractive girls behind the counter. Her eyes flickered around the room. There were drinks spilling, bartenders shaking, glasses clinking, and people making out in the corner. This was a bar, all right. A far cry from the high-end clubs that she often visited with Dorothea, but it was comfortable in a different way. People put on less of a character, and doubly so when they had alcohol in their system. She didn't recognize anybody so far, but she knew that odds were at least one person would recognize her. Not as Edelgard or as the Queen of Flames, but rather as a wandering mercenary. At any rate, the last thing she wanted to do was actually socialize with other people, so instead of looking for someone she recognized, she made a beeline for the bar. There was Tanya, there was Seals, there was Yuri Leclerc. Exactly who she was here to see. "Why hello," he said, "if it isn't my favorite hot merc." Yuri was the owner and part-time bartender of Leclerc. Though she wasn't sure what circumstances led him to be running a bar in Abyss, she knew that he had quite the reputation in the Undercity. He was quite handsome, and his purple hair made him stick out like a sore thumb among the crowd. With charm and wit alike he bewitched many with his flirtatious nature and his androgyny. It wasn't a night if Yuri didn't take someone home with him, and honestly she'd be surprised if someone didn't offer. Even she was a bit flustered whenever he complimented her, almost as if his piercing gaze cut right through her mask. It was the trained eyes of a killer, and that she knew he had experience with. And though he wasn't too much older than her, Yuri curried enough favor to be privy to all of the illegal dealings in the Undercity. And he also acted as an intermediary between clients and mercenaries, giving jobs to those who needed it and spreading the name of those willing to do the impossible. For a price, of course. Yuri was her fixer, more or less. Though he wasn't her only source of information, he knew the machinations and power struggles of the underworld much better than the Queen of Flames did. And so for quite a few credits, Edelgard was able to gain his trust and buy her way into information she should not have been privy to. But nowadays, their relationship was much stronger after all. Edelgard got things done. She wondered if he ever suspected her identity as the Queen of Flames, since in this outfit she wasn't exactly screaming out that she was the scourge of the enforcers. Yes, she thought, he's far too smart to not connect the dots. But luckily for me, Yuri is a firm believer of operational security. If it isn't my favorite bartender, Edelgard said dryly. And you can't really call me hot if you've never seen my face. Ah, but I'm simply an optimist, he said. And maybe you'll show me that beautiful face sometime, won't you? Thank the heavens that she was wearing her mask, because suddenly the room got way more hot than it should have been. I'll consider it after a few decades, she said. She finally took a proper seat on a stool in front of a tap, close enough to other people as to not arouse suspicion but not close enough for people to eavesdrop coherently. She shook her right leg, moving up and down and trying to shake her jitters out. Yuri smiled. So, he said, what's the request today? Do you know anything about a Project Sethline? Yuri's eyes widened. Sethline? Like? I don't know. Sethline isn't exactly a common name. Not what I meant. That statement was definitely loaded, and now Edelgard knew that Yuri knew something. So, do you know anything? I'll make it worth your while. She realized that she must have looked a bit odd sitting without ordering anything. Actually, she said, "get me a Galatian gusher." On my tab. With a few quick flourishes Yuri put together a sparkling purple concoction, and handed her an ornate glass with it. She took it, gingerly placing it to her lips, and took a sip. Exactly how she had remembered. "You said," Yuri replied, "that you'll make it worth it." "Yeah." Yuri looked at the ceiling pointedly for a moment. Then he looked back at Edelgard, his lavender eyes piercing through her gaze as usual. "All right. I will give you what you need." She muttered, "There's a but somewhere in there, huh?" "Biryut," he said with an exaggerated drawl, "you're gonna have to run another mission for me." She smacked her forehead. "Goddess, may she rest, damn it. Probably another shitty fetch quest, to look for a rare item and kill anybody in her way. And of course Yuri would be the one to know something. Why couldn't she just bribe Balthus instead of going off on a wild goose chase for a girl she didn't even know existed until a day ago? Edelgard gave him her best steely-eyed look, despite the fact that he couldn't see her eyes. "Fine. What is it?" "It's a simple laboratory raid," he said. "One of my agents went missing investigating a lead. I want you to go inside and let me know what happened." "There's a twist to that, huh? It seems too easy." She paused. "Are you hiding something?" Which was a true question, but it didn't make it any less stupid. He had his secrets. After all, what bartender didn't? But she knew better to pry, because you never want to mess with the guy serving the drinks. "In due time you'll understand," said Yuri. "I've sent the details along to you." Her holodeck buzzed, and she glanced down while Yuri had his back turned for a moment. "You have 10 missed calls, from Bernie Bear. Details for job. XOXO, Claude. Urgent, Miss Flames. Reply. Please renew your ID again. Remire Science Experiment." There it was. Now all she needed was to execute the job perfectly and start planning. "Thanks, Yuri." She got up to leave. "That's all for now, I guess. Sure you don't want to stay the night?" "I can, of course. We're well beyond baseless flirting, Leclerc," she hissed. "I'm leaving." All right, he said. "I get it. I'll see you soon." "Yeah." She took her glass and walked out, which if Yuri wasn't distracted would probably not end well since those were his expensive wine glasses. Still, he probably wouldn't notice, and so she kept on sipping her Galatian gusher. Balthus smiled at her as she walked out, and she muttered a quick thanks to him before she left. Then something occurred to her, something that she had glossed over when she was looking through her holodeck. "Oh shit," she thought as she stepped into the cobblestone streets of Abyss. "I forgot to call Bernadetta in time. She's going to strangle me, isn't she?" Chapter 7, The Beast Within. It was difficult to get used to reading unit positions from a simple holographic map with red and blue dots. Almost as if the lives of all of her soldiers had been reduced to nothing but ones and zeros, as her dots danced around set positions she marked on the map. She knew that with each order, the lives of her subordinates were at stake. And yet Edelgard still did not know what they were to her. Were they trusted comrades, or pawns to be used to further her goals? Would she be willing to sacrifice them for the bigger picture? Yes. I would. To save her from dwelling on the question too much, Yuri's face finally popped up over video feed. He had the most conspiratorial grin on his face, and his purple eyes shone even through a screen. He was handsome, and some would even call him beautiful. But she was not focusing on his looks, but rather what really hid behind those eyes of his. "Yuri. Mind telling me what you want here? I sent you those coordinates because I need it investigated." As promised, the bartender of Leclerc had sent her a set of coordinates to investigate. Though she wanted to go alone, it was only the nagging of her operator that made her bring her subordinates. Both Petra and Casper's squads were in position to strike, and she lingered slightly further away. And though it had been a full day since her injury and it had mostly healed, she still felt the searing heat of the Death Knight's blade in her torso. Her early days of combat were like that, but it had been a long time since she received a wound that severe. The location was far away from her hideout, hidden in the outskirts of Remire district. Satellite imagery revealed a small farmhouse, which was most likely the secret entrance to an underground lab of sorts. As she had sent Petra out for a recon op the morning before, she found that it enjoyed a constant stream of traffic, along with many shipments on an otherwise ignored road. A perfect place to hide something. Petra McNeary, she was quite an interesting woman. It was no secret that she was the missing Brigid princess who had been lost to the Empire after they crushed her family's rebellion. Her entire family had been killed, and only she was spared by virtue of being off-world at the time. She had been sent to Newfoundland to learn how to be a better ruler, but all she really learned was how to be a better vassal to the God Emperor. So after her formal schooling and the death of her nation, she took her sword and vanished into the depths of the abyss to become a feared warrior. She had quite the talent for assassination, using guile where she could and using her daggers when that failed. Her skill with a blade was second only to her beauty, and she used both to cut through the corrupt elite of Newfoundland. So when Edelgard found herself crossing blades with a woman who sought the same target, they found themselves instead turning their blades on the guards that had been sent to stop them. And that was how two orphans met one another, cutting down scores of enemies in the pursuit of a better empire. And the information about the project? Edelgard asked. None of my sources have turned up anything, other than a few scattered pieces of research data. I have heard of acetylene before, he admitted, but only from my mother. I wasn't aware that a Mama Leclerc even existed. She exists. Regardless, said Yuri, I'll tell you once you raid that lab. And perhaps it might contain some of what you're looking for anyway. Perhaps. She really didn't want to stake the lives of her men on a long shot, but it was the best option she had so far. And Yuri had never failed her before. Well, except for that time he gave her a short island iced tea instead of the Bloody Reaper she wanted. That, she would probably hold against him for the rest of her life. Thank you, Yuri. I'll see you soon. Good luck, he replied, and with that the comm link closed. The Queen of Flames sat on her hoverbike a few clicks away from the site of the raid, as she saw through the eyes of her drone. It was vaguely eagle-shaped, with an airfoil and thrusters that gave it the silhouette of a bird flying through the sky. In the day this wasn't the greatest disguise, as with careful heat detection the drone's emissions could be seen. But to the average radar station and onlooker it was simply another bird in the sky. And at night it was doubly as effective, the black camo paint making it almost impossible to see. If it weren't for Bernadetta managing its flight paths carefully, she doubted it would be possible to fly it in the cover of darkness. It monitored the perimeter, in case she had any guests that decided to come. The house was very far in the suburbs, which meant that at night the world was eerily quiet. The forest surrounding it was dark, and she swore she could hear the clicking of insects and the telltale hoot of an owl. Above her, the blue sea star shone brightly, as the moon waxed and illuminated her bike with the gentle glow of moonlight. Edelgard looked at the stars, or at least the few that were visible due to the blatant light pollution caused by the city. She wondered about the worlds that she had never seen, about the stars she might never explore. She thought if they, too, had thoughts of rebellion against an empire that spanned the solar system. Edelgard wondered if she might one day spot the Nemesis, the colony ship that served as the capital of the empire. Of course his namesake governed his worlds from it, traveling from world to reinforce his iron grip on each and every planet. Though he had conquered all of the planets and their satellites long ago, rebellions and war between factions were commonplace. It was his imperial army that had to put down any rebellious element, and make an example of them. She thought of the planet of Brigid, who had terraformed a planet as a free people only to be subjugated in the Unification War. She thought of the world of Almira, whose war was so brutal that the God Emperor forced their people into servitude and turned their royal family into political puppets with no power. And she thought of Newfoundland itself, humanity's home world reclaimed after a brutal war decimated its surface. When she really thought about it, she was only one speck in the infinite expanse of space, and she knew that it would take much more than just her to make real change. But the least she could do was be a thorn in the side of the Empire, and a thorn could be much more than a simple annoyance given time. But first, she thought, she needed to succeed on this mission. Petra, she asked on her comms. What's your status? Entrance is upcoming, she said through the channel. I am positioned. Good. She always did have a strange way of phrasing things. Casper. Ready to rock and roll, Your Highness," a voice buzzed in reply. That last part was Casper's honorific for her, and it was about as serious as Casper's disposition in general. Both teams of 6 were meant to infiltrate in a pincer movement. While the farmhouse itself had a single entrance, each team would stagger their infiltration to assess their weak points and strike accordingly. Petra's team was meant to disable the security systems by jacking into the network, and Bernadetta would take care of the rest. Casper's team would then enter, taking a different route, and searching for the server room. Both teams would then rendezvous at a chosen point once the facility was mapped. She expected heavy resistance. Yuri mentioned that one of his scouts went missing after exploring, and that was probably due to enforcers. The secrecy and isolation implied a facility of decent importance, so that also had to include a decent amount of security as well. But she trusted in both of her teams to cut through anybody in their way. They were both battle-tested, and Edelgard had made sure of that by throwing them into situations where combat was an inevitability. They were her finest soldiers, and though deaths were occasional and mourned solemnly, for the most part they were incredibly successful. "You have your orders," she said. "Petra, take your team in." Moving. Petra brought her team inside the farmhouse, as light blue dots converged on Edelgard's map. She pulled up a view from Petra's bodycam to see what was going on, as she watched her slip past the view of a few security cameras with some quick movements before slapping one of Bernie's gadgets onto the back of a camera. Edelgard couldn't see what it was doing, but as the gadget clicked into place she heard a squeal of delight from her operator. Presumably, that meant that she had gained access to the security system and could now loop the cameras, feed false information, and get up to all sorts of hijinks. Though Bernadetta wasn't usually one to mess around during an operation, she knew that she enjoyed hacking into things and causing chaos. With a small flourish of her vibroblades, Petra sliced the lock on the entrance open, and with that her team moved in. They were dressed to the nines with tactical gear, black body armor and quite the arsenal of weapons among them. Amine, her second in command, wielded a Kusarigama that doubled as a grappling hook. There were heat swords in scabbards, hollow daggers strapped to waists, and even a hidden wrist blade on one of her soldiers. She spared no expense on their gear, because a poorly equipped mercenary was a dead one. They pushed on, through the door and piled into the elevator that would lead them down into the facility. Bernadetta was busy hacking the cameras to both obscure their moment and come up with an accurate floor plan of the facility. As the map unfolded before her eyes, Edelgard could do nothing but nervously await what was at the bottom of the elevator. All she could hear was the whir of the elevator as it rushed down. Then a ding as the door opened. Edelgard didn't know what she expected. An ambush at the foot of an elevator? Booby traps? A giant monster, waiting to eat them? But she was disappointed when she only found another empty hallway, and more rooms to explore. "Split into pairs," she ordered. "Take each room and check for important documents. Be careful." After some quick discussion, Petra's squad split into 3 pairs, and they fanned out to check each room. Clear. 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 What's this? Edelgard switched views to Amine's feed, where she saw a document folder that was clearly labeled classified. Though black ink covered most of it, she could make out certain phrases and images. Nabatian, she read. The heteromorphic vessel, augmentations, derived from blood. Scales serve as basis for, missing component. Amine must have been reading it too, because her eyes were fixed to the paper. "None of this makes any sense," she radioed. "We'll analyze it later," said Edelgard. "Just flip through it and make sure Bernie can splice it together later." "Roger." Amine and her partner moved to the next room, and as the teams worked their way down the hallway Edelgard felt a strange sense of dread. It was quiet. Far too quiet. Where were the enforcers? Or the scientists? This was a laboratory, not a cemetery, and yet it sounded much more like the latter. Each room's equipment had been scattered, not out of violence but as if they had simply been in a hurry to abandon it. Normally protocol would dictate that documents would be burned, equipment destroyed, and all evidence would be destroyed without a trace. Or at least, that was what Edelgard would do if she was made. Were they intentionally leaving things behind to be discovered? Or was the information simply not worth it to risk the lives of Newfoundland's brilliant minds? "Found something," said one of the soldiers. That was Vitus, whose enthusiasm was matched only by Casper during missions. He knelt down next to a body in the hallway, slumped over with a blade in her stomach. Blood had dripped from the wound, but the lack of decomposition and how dried it was suggested that this woman had probably died within the last few days. She wore an imperial officer uniform, slightly light on armor plating but with the usual white and blue blade-resistant fabric. Her face was contorted in horror, as if she was staring at the wall behind him. He turned around and... nothing. Just another wall. Almost as if her body had been moved, which was obvious in hindsight once Edelgard noticed the trail of blood from the entrance. From the video feed Edelgard could see a small little chip on a keychain, which Vitus grabbed and slotted it into his holodeck. Though the signal was somewhat faint, he was still connected to Bernadetta's servers, and she could hear the rapid tapping of her operator as she sifted through the files. Videos, memes, videos, videos, I didn't want to see that, Bernadetta muttered. I'm going to bleach my eyes. Oh dash. She had found something. It's titled Important.mp7. A bit on the nose, but sure. Is it actually important, though? Edelgard asked. See for yourself. While the teams continued through the various rooms and subrooms, checking cabinets and computers for any information they could glean, Edelgard was sitting down on the grass, her back leaning on the hoverbike as she stared intently into the distance and also at the images dancing on her visor. She opened the video Bernie had sent her, which opened to reveal the face of the corpse she had seen only moments ago. But she wasn't in much better shape, considering the small trickle of blood from her lower lip and a gaping wound on her cheek. She was holding up the camera with the last bit of her strength, as she was clearly slumped against a wall as blood pooled around her. This was a dying confession. My name, the woman whispered, is Monica Oakes. Her voice was hoarse, and barely above a murmur. She gagged, spitting out blood onto the floor as a couple drops got onto the camera. I want you to know. I was only following orders. You know, I never expected to be reassigned out here. I was top of my class at the academy, and on my last mission they told me I was gonna be sent out here. To the fucking boonies, to some shitty laboratory inside Remire. As punishment for loving someone far below my station. So when they told us to guard the lab for the magistrate, I thought none of it. And then I saw the experiments. These damned men and women in white lab coats might as well have been wearing a butcher's uniform. They were experimenting on children, no younger than I was when I went into middle school. I can still hear their screams, echoing in my head. It was all I could to put a pillow over my head when it was my shift to sleep. I didn't see any of it. I just stood in front of the door as a kid went in, and a containment tank went out. And that made me guilty. Damned, more than any murderer, more than the ones that ordered it. I was a bystander. And there was a special place in Alel for those. I prayed that something would happen. That the divine javelins of light would be brought down upon this laboratory, that somebody would discover it. I had never been a believer, you know? That there had ever been a goddess, and how could she be dead if there was never one in the first place? But I prayed regardless. Captain Morris was the only one who understood. We didn't dare speak of it, as the walls had ears and eyes. Yet there was a silent understanding between us. A steely-eyed gaze, a face devoid of emotion except for the twitch in his lip as the kids were marched in. So one day, as a poor little girl was dragged in by the scruff of her collar kicking and screaming, we were standing outside the door. And we locked eyes. I can't pretend to understand what he was thinking. But I think I know. When the door opened once more, the girl was gone. And so Captain Morris walked in and slipped 6 inches of steel into the head researcher's stomach, before one of the other guards stabbed him. I was about to rush in before I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was a man with long flowing black hair and beady eyes. But I knew who it was. Thales, Hand of the Emperor himself. Don't worry, he said. Your time will come soon enough. I couldn't move, transfixed in horror. He stepped into the room, test tubes, and everything thrown everywhere. What was left of the little girl lay on the operating table, not moving. And Captain Morris was gurgling, blood spewing from his mouth. Thales kneeled down next to him and produced a syringe. You, he said, "will make a magnificent test subject." He put the needle into his neck and then all hell broke loose. Black blood oozed from his mouth. I heard noises that shouldn't have come from a human. I don't even remember much. Just a lot of screaming. Shouting. The monster that was once my captain munched on the bones of my fellow soldiers. I am a coward. I left. Ran with all my might towards the entrance, but as I crossed the threshold Thales got me with his sword in the end. Dragged my body back inside and stabbed me again for good measure. Said something about how the lab was a calculated loss, and how there were many to spare. Then he left. Like he was never even here. Why? Why was the empire I loved so much doing this? Was this Thales, or was this the God Emperor's will all along? What was right? The empire was a cruel joke, built upon the suffering of others that I had been so blind to. All my life. If you see this, promise me one thing. That you'll cut a path to your own future. I could have saved those children if I just fought. From the first child I saw. Instead of sitting around and watching, only to die forgotten. I'm sorry. 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 I'm so sorry. I don't want to die. Please. I want to live. I want to see Vanya again. I want to. The woman once called Monica's voice faded out, and her jaw went slack for the final time. Edelgard knew that was it. She blinked, expecting to feel the telltale wetness of tears. But she felt nothing, and that was when she knew that deep down she was broken. She watched as the video feed cut out and faded back to a view of her soldiers scattering like insects, searching for more evidence. Behind that the grass of the forest glittered with dew, as she stared blankly. Processing. Still processing what she had seen. She wasn't shocked. Far from it. She was one of those little girls, who went into a room just like that and came out something less than human. They had cut out something that day, and she felt it dig into her each and every movement, its cold touch scarring her skin, slicing it open. Make it stop, make it stop, make it. Edelgard clenched her fists so hard she felt something crack. She didn't want to think about any of that. And now she was faced with undeniable evidence that what had happened to her continued to this day. The torturing of fresh-faced children, experimenting on them, turning them into monsters, the advancements of science dripped with the blood of the innocent. Crimes against humanity. No, even the goddess herself, as inhuman as she might have been, would spit in the face of these butchers. You've gotta cut a path to the future you wish for, no matter what. Once upon a time, she would have cried. But there was no room for tears in the heart of Edelgard von Hresvelg, Queen of Flames. So she moved on. She had to, for the sake of a woman named Monica Oakes. By now Casper's team had entered, checking the dormitories where people stayed. It was quite the intricate maze, and it took all of Bernadetta's skills to stitch together a proper map. They tore apart rooms looking for anything, maybe a hidden secret, a stash of weapons, anything that would give them a clue as to what the hell was going on. Edelgard stayed silent about the video she had seen. They didn't need to know. They wouldn't want to know anyway. Petra was at the end of the hallway, where she crouched next to a door. It was perfectly flush with the wall, and the hinges were built in a way where it was not easily accessible until the door was opened. This was a security door, though it lacked the material needed to actually keep anybody out. But it would keep honest people out just by virtue of being there, and that was what she supposed the purpose was. She used her shoulder to shove the door, but it wouldn't budge. Breaching charges, she asked. One of her men slid her a spray canister of explosive gel, and she carefully applied it to both edges of the door. She then smacked a blasting cap, backing away slowly, and waited for a couple agonizing seconds. 1. 2. Then, with a loud boom that blew out the audio feed for a brief second, the door flew off its hinges and backward, hitting the floor with a thud. With vibroblade in one hand and flashlight in the other, Petra carefully led her team into the darkened room. It was auditorium-sized, and even shining a flashlight barely illuminated the room. As they fanned out to search each and every corner, maybe even to find a light switch, their chems scanned each and every tile, leaving no stone unturned. But for the most part it was empty. That is, until Petra paused in horror, and at that exact moment Bernadetta's voice buzzed in over the channel. "This place is dead. Or at least, there's nobody living here." "What?" "But the enforcers. And I think that's Yuri's scout." She realized what Petra was looking at. It was a half-mutilated carcass, barely recognizable as anything human. The only discerning feature it had was its outfit, which had been ripped to shreds. But his left hand was still intact, and in it was a bloodied manila folder. She leaned over to grab it, carefully slipping it inside of a knapsack she carried before moving on. Edelgard swore she heard her whisper something in Brigida prayer, perhaps. Then the lights flickered on, and Edelgard swore violently as her men looked up. Bodies. Bodies were hanging from the ceiling, hooks embedded in them with wounds caked in dried blood. She refused to take in the details, or at least tried to refuse, but she noticed that they were contorted in grotesque shapes. Bones poked out where they shouldn't, and muscles bulged in an abnormal manner. It was almost as if they were failed experiments. But why were they hanging? The intercom flared to life. "I see," boomed a voice that seemed oddly familiar, "that this facility has some unwanted guests." "Casper," she hissed. "Come down. Now." "Got it," replied her lieutenant, and his team rushed away from their floor and towards the elevator. She had a bad feeling that this was gonna go south very quickly, and having an additional set of bodies would probably help. Every fiber in her body wanted to rush down there, to pull out her axe and fight whatever was speaking over the intercom. But she knew that she had to stay above ground to cover their escape, and with gritted teeth she did not move. "Who are you?" shouted Petra. "What business are you doing?" "You know too much," the voice said. "And that will be your undoing." As if on cue, she heard a bone-chilling roar. She had barely noticed it, but in the corner of the chamber stood something. It wasn't human, more like an animal, with draconic features and a long snout. Yet it lacked wings, and instead had the physique of a massive bear, its large body filling up the corner. It was massive, and could be mistaken for a small tank from its silhouette if not for its four legs that looked more like massive tree trunks. She noticed that part of its front right leg was missing, and instead had been replaced at the knee with a mechanical contraption. Black ooze dripped from holes in its body, and its scaly hide was partially stained red with blood. Its eyes glowed a fiery red, and now it was looking right at her. No. It was looking right at Petra. And it looked like it was starving. The creature rushed forward, trampling the debris in its path as it crawled forward at an unnaturally fast speed. Petra's chem wasn't moving, and she just stared at the massive beast coming closer and closer. "Petra!" shouted Amina, and that brought her back to reality. She barely dodged the beast running in and chomping where her head had been with its massive jaws with a quick roll. As Petra got to her feet, she unsheathed both her vibroblades and took up a fighting stance. Though her team was spread around the room, each brought their weapons and eyed the beast, tracking each of its movements carefully. The beast quickly turned and moved toward one of the other soldiers, and while he readied his sword in defiance, quickly found that any combat training was useless in the face of a beast. Vitus dodged the beast's charge, using his plasma blade to slice through the beast's hind legs. If it were any normal animal this would have severed them clean off, but instead it only gouged a shallow cut as he scrambled to bring his sword around in time. The beast barely reacted, instead opting to whirl around at an unnaturally fast speed and snap its jaws at him. A lucky sidestep was all that stood between him and the beast. "Shit!" shouted Edelgard. "The tendons, try that." Another one of her soldiers rushed in behind the beast, stabbing it in the flank. Or at least, tried to. The dagger barely broke the skin and only went in a few inches before the beast nearly took her head off with a strong kick. Amina's Kuzarigama left glancing blows and forced the beast to keep moving, or its chain would entangle its legs and keep it from moving. Petra, recovering from her indecisiveness, dashed around the beast, cutting where she could and aiming for vulnerable spots. Tendons, vitals, even its head. But that was a dangerous game. All it took was a single mistake. A single lapse of concentration. From Amina's feet Edelgard saw that she was dancing around the beast's head, aiming for its eyes to blind it. And as it opened to snap its jaws shut around her body, Amina threw her blade into the roof of its mouth. It was a solid strike, and the beast charged forward at Amina while she struggled to rip her blade out. But it wasn't budging, and as she tried to run she felt herself yanked back as the cord of her weapon went taut, falling to the floor. Though the beast couldn't open its mouth for fear of dislodging the weapon and choking on it, it charged right at her helpless form. There wasn't enough time. Even as she vaulted to her feet and scrambled, even as the Kusarigama slipped out of her grip, the beast charged, and it was Petra who slammed her out of the way. "No!" shouted someone. She didn't know who it was. Was it her? The beast hit Petra slightly on her side so she was spared the full impact, but it was enough to slam her directly into the wall behind her. Petra's chin went dark from the impact, but she could hear the sickening crunch from Amina's. No. No. It couldn't be. Amina screamed, and the other 4 soldiers moved to cover her. They renewed their offensive, 4 blades moving in unison, cutting gashes into the beast and forcing it to deal with them first. It was a slow dance with the beast swiping, soldiers scrambling for cover and attacking it when there was an opening. But even Alice's poisoned glaive and Vitus's plasma blade were leaving surface damage at best, and they were on a ticking clock. Edelgard flipped from cam to cam, searching for something, maybe a weakness, anything that could be used to defeat the beast. In the background, she could dimly see Amina administering first aid, her Kusarigama uselessly left beside her. She flipped to Vitus's cam just as the beast closed its jaws around his head and the video feed went dark. Now Alice screamed in anguish, and so did his teammates. He led the charge, plunging his glaive into the beast's shoulder, but that only served to enrage it. But every second that he spent dancing around, every little wound that he inflicted bought them time. Maybe with time they had a chance. And maybe more firepower. "Incendiaries," shouted Edelgard over the comms. "Use something with high yield." Amina knelt beside her leader. "I'll take it down with me if I have to." She grabbed Petra's belt and took out a few grenades, and Edelgard could see her hands shaking. She wanted so badly to rush in. So badly to march in with her axe and cleave that damned beast in half. "If you go now, you're trapping them all in there," reminded Bernadetta over the radio. "You need to be there to cover their escape." That was the agreed-on plan. That was her plan. But she couldn't just. Edelgard swore. She had to sit there and listen to the screams of her men as they died horrible deaths. Petra. She wasn't moving. But she could see her chest rise up and down, so maybe, just maybe. "Fucking shit," shouted a voice, and Edelgard couldn't help but sigh in relief. Casper and his team of idiots ran to their aid, sprinting into the room and pretty much throwing themselves at the monster. Casper himself led the charge, leaping up and delivering a massive punch to the beast's forehead, or at least what she thought was the forehead, with his power gauntlets. It stumbled, and instantly 4 swords found themselves buried inside the beast's legs. Flesh was moving around at lightning speed, looking for any openings she could slip an explosive into while slashing away with her dagger. The beast roared in pain, which was the first sign that their attacks were actually doing anything. It reared up on its hind legs and came down with a sickening crash, knocking some soldiers away with the sheer force of the impact. But they all sprung to their feet, raising their blades and pressing the attack. "For Vitus!" Alice shouted. She had never heard his voice before, and it was a strong and stern one, but she could tell that he was close to breaking. Another person, dead. Another friend. "For Vitus!" shouted the soldiers, and so they kept attacking. They could kill it. With their combined efforts, they were forcing the beast to move defensively rather than attack, and black ooze gushed from its wounds. Though the more shallow ones were repairing, the deeper ones festered, and Edelgard suppressed the urge to retch. A heavy blow from Casper, an explosive blast near its head, Vitus's sword being plunged into its stomach. They were winning. But as a sliver of hope crept into Edelgard's heart, the perimeter alarm had been triggered and buzzed incessantly in her head. It reminded Edelgard that victory never was that easy. "REI reinforcements. Down the main road." "There's too many, boss, what do we do?" Her map filled with red icons coming in down the main road, an army even by conservative estimates. No doubt to finish her and her men off. No. The worst case scenario. Edelgard realized that it was about to get very, very, bloody. Chapter 8, Rules of Nature. "Casper," she yelled over her communicator. "Get out of there. We need to kill it, he argued. To avenge Vitus. Casper, I'm ordering you. You think he would want you back in a body bag? But we're so damn close. I don't care how close. You need to go. Now. Fine, Queen of Flames, he growled. All units, retreat. Regroup at the elevator. The last thing she wanted for her lieutenants was to die over a damn lizard. The sound of fighting died down over the comms, and Edelgard continued walking towards the main road. On her screen pulsed a single lone blue dot, heading toward a massive enemy force that seemed hell-bent on her destruction. She hoped that it was a bug with her drones scouting, that there was no way they had sent so many for her small team. Unfortunately for her, she was still wrong. Edelgard was expecting many things as she stepped out of the forest and onto the road. But the one thing she did not expect was one Hubert von Vestra standing before her. Hubert. He now towered over her, though he had always been a few inches taller. He stood in a perfectly creased suit, arms by his side waiting expectantly. Only the badge on his chest signified his importance, the purple insignia of the magistrate gleaming in the darkness. His jet black hair, he must have grown it out quite a lot, was swept messily to one side, covering his right eye. And with his left he simply stared at her, his eye peering into her soul. Oh, he had grown. He had grown into a handsome man, yet the happiness she wished him was simply not there in his stone-cold gaze. Deputy Director of the Magistrate's Intelligence Division Hubert von Vestra was by all accounts terrifying, and she guessed that mothers told their children to be good or Hubert would come. What little she could glean about his life told only the story of a man devoted to his work, erasing threats to the magistrate before they even had time to take hold. The Queen of Flames, he said dryly. In the flesh, she replied. Director Vestra. Hubert smiled in his usual creepy manner, the kind that got under your skin. To what do I owe the pleasure of seeing you here? Cut the formalities, Hubert. Hubert? I wasn't aware that we were on a first-name basis. Shit. It just slipped out so easily, calling him by his name. No doubt few would dare to ever call him Hubert, especially with his newfound status. And yet part of her wondered if he might be still loyal, if he still believed in Edelgard. What if she told him the truth now? Would he believe her? If she took off her helmet and revealed who she really was? No. She doubted it. Even if he believed her, despite the fact that she was a completely different person, Hubert was loyal. And if he was part of the magistrate, she knew what he was really loyal to. I wasn't aware the magistrate's lapdog would come all the way out here just to kill me. Edelgard spat. Did you suppose your raiding of the facility would go unnoticed? He replied. And you allow this? There, experimentation on children. Her voice was raised now, and she knew that if she continued she might betray a little too much about who she really was. If you knew about this facility, then you are a butcher, just like the rest of them. Hubert had no reaction, except for a small, nearly imperceptible twitch of his lip. To anyone else it might have been meaningless, but to Edelgard, it was a sign how he really felt. That maybe he was disgusted, and maybe he hated working with people who used children as no more than disposable bodies. He hated showing emotion, and yet here he was. He could cover up everything but how he really felt. Edelgard recalled a memory of the two long ago. My lady Edelgard, he said. You must eat. Edelgard sat there cross-legged, refusing to say anything. Hubert pushed the plate of meat and vegetables closer to her. Yet though it smelled so good, she found herself without the will to eat anything. So she just sat there. Hubert sighed. His cheeks were red and had already lost the chubbiness of a child despite being only 2 years older than her. His gaze was filled with concern. Because after all, what was the point of a vassal if he did not fret over his liege? I will be here all day and all night if needed. They sat there for goddess knows how long, with only agonizing silence between them. She was just staring at the wall in front of her, in her chambers at the palace. She had cleared everything off her wall and off her desk, and her clothing was neatly folded and half tucked into a brown satchel. Her books, her little toys, even the wood axe that she used to smack Hubert with when he was misbehaving were all gone. All that was left were her messy bedsheets and the hardwood floor that the two sat on. She was only pretending to stare at the wall. Her mind went through each and every one of her memories here. Her two little siblings, her older ones who now towered above her and no longer had time to play with her. She remembered the ladies-in-waiting who would sneak her treats and let her sip their coffee when her mother wasn't looking. And when her father came, when he wasn't hounded by the ghosts of empire and honor, she could only hug him tightly until he had no choice but to move away. And now her parents were gone. Did she know where they were? She had the vaguest sense that father was still languishing somewhere in the palace, under constant guard. For what reason she did not know, Hubert had told her that it was his father's fault. Was her father misbehaving, or was his father? She did not understand. Where had mother gone? She had left little Elle with a note, that said to go with her uncle. That it was safer if they travelled separately. Travelled where? She asked her uncle Lord Arundel. He simply replied with a word. Ferdiad. Where was that? He pointed on a globe where it was, but she did not understand. She had never been outside of the empire, outside of Adrestia where it was warm and sunny and comfortable. She had never seen snow, nor mountains, nor the freezing winds they talked about in the stories she read. This was her home. He told her not to tell anyone. Secrecy, her uncle said, was a special promise. And Elle would be misbehaving if she broke promises, right? So she did. Not even to her maids, not even to her best friend in the whole wide world Hubert. But she did not want to leave. Hubert was so stubborn. He refused to address her by anything but lady or liege. And there was always a my, as if he and her were bound together. Edelgard always wanted to just have him close as a friend, as a confidant. Not out of some deluded sense of honor, or whatever nonsense his father fed her about familial duty and how the Vestras had served the Hresvelgs since the days of Wilhelm I. She just wanted to play tag like she used to. To bonk him on the head whenever he got too cocky in her game of war, to chase him around the garden while her mother chased her, or at least, pretended to chase her. She wanted to tell him about the books he read, and traded stories about their days. She wanted to keep learning from him about magic, even if she could not conjure so much as a spark of light. And now she could not even say goodbye. She could not even tell him that she was leaving. Hubert just sat there, until day turned to night and his eyes closed. He was slumped against a wall, and she could tell that he was trying desperately not to fall asleep as his eyes blinked open every hour or so. But even for an 11-year-old boy it was impossible for him to avoid the clutches of sleep. So when she knew he was asleep, she leaned over and whispered. Hubert, Her voice caught in her throat. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize to me, he muttered. I will always be yours. But how? How can you say that when I can't even dash? His eyes fluttered open and he raised his hand. Don't say it. I know. Know what? I know there are a great many burdens only you can carry. But I will shoulder the ones that you cannot. Hubert. She slid next to him and leaned her head on his shoulder. And she wept, though only a few tears trickled down her face. She wept for all that she had lost, and all that she might lose. She wept for her father and her mother, lost to forces out of her control. She wept for the end of her childhood. To say goodbye to Inber. To Hubert. In the morning the carriage would come, and she would be taken away. A princess, being whisked away to a foreign land. It was something out of a storybook. And yet she did not feel like a princess, but more like a prisoner. It was all she could to memorize every detail of the palace, every memory she had here and keep them neatly organized in that brain of hers. Whether the hidden stash of butter was, where she kept the parasol she had snatched from her mother, and where the peephole was that she used to snoop on the war council. And she tried her best to memorize the people, their faces, and their little quirks and everything that made them them. Would she be remembered? Little brown-haired Mousiel? Would they remember the girl who loved sweets and her stuffed bunny, or would she just be another forgotten ghost of Inber? As she sobbed and sobbed until Hubert fell asleep once more, all she could do was stare at the moonlight streaming through the window. That perhaps the goddess would listen to her prayers, and that she might stay. For there to be a happy ending in her storybook tale. But the goddess never answered. What? That wasn't how it happened. And those were certainly not her memories. She had never gone into exile. And in her mind's eye she saw Hubert, older than he had been in the memory, being injected with a needle before he could kill any more assailants with his dagger. He swore that he would protect her with his life. She was kicking and screaming as they dragged Edelgard away from Hubert's unconscious body, and he could only croak out a few words before he lost consciousness. That was the last time she saw Hubert for almost a decade. And now he was here, as conflicting memories swirled inside her and two worlds collided. Who was she? Which wasn't as pressing of a question as, who was Hubert von Vestra now? If, he said, that is true, no doubt the magistrate had its purpose. He said the last word like it was an epithet, his disgust clear. The strong survive off the sacrifices of the weak. For the sake of science. You wouldn't dare, she growled. You would sacrifice children. And what do you know of sacrifice, he said. I have sacrificed everything for my master. You serve a tyrant, like the unfeeling lapdog you are. It hurt a little for Edelgard to say it, but she was furious. What had Hubert become? Where had the sweet boy she had known as a child gone, who would fight for his friends and family with his life? He was replaced by this specter of a man, who spoke of sacrifice. And yet, Edelgard had to wonder if she was much better. Did the Queen of Flames have it in her to commit a great evil to destroy a greater evil? Would she do the same? She knew the answer to that. And she hated herself for it. I only serve one master, Hubert von Vestra replied. And she has been dead for years. Her ears burned and her head throbbed. Could it be? Hubert, wait. She moved forward quickly, reaching forward to grab him. But as she moved she found her hand passing through air, as the hologram showing Hubert shimmered and vanished. The drone projecting it quickly shot off into the sky, probably to whatever building he was operating from. And then, it was just her there in a grassy field, staring into the night sky. Which was odd, because there was supposed to be an army approaching. Bernadetta, she asked over the comms. She received no reply. Shit. The signals jammed. But her map still showed the telltale signs of a massive enemy attack, as red dots blinked into view. Her team in blue and purple were still in the process of extracting from the laboratory below her, as they were still dimmed to show a significant distance in altitude. Most likely the elevator power had been cut, and they were climbing up the stairs in an effort to get to their vehicles and escape. Her goal was simply to buy time until they were able to escape, and she hoped that the beast had not claimed another life. Buy time for what? Why would the enemy know, Hubert, create IFF tags that weren't real? It could have been to simply scare her by creating the illusion of attack, but that made no sense because she could see there was nothing in front of her. There were no vehicles rolling around, no planes flying through, not even the telltale sound of soldiers moving in. Unless, it was a distraction. A single blue dot cut through her map, and Edelgard whirled around to see the telltale sign of a plane streaking through the sky. It soared right over her head so fast she could barely see it apart from its trail, as it ejected a black object from its cargo bay that was sent tumbling to the forest below. Her first instinct was to duck for cover. If the Empire was using bombardment against her little ragtag team, they must have been truly desperate. To bomb their own nation was truly desperate, and a sign that perhaps their grasp on society was not as tight as they seemed. It would raise questions, and questions were not something the magistrate liked very much. But, considering no alarms on her visor went off, it meant that the object lacked the telltale signature of explosive ordnance, and so Edelgard did not move. This, she mused, was some sort of drop. Maybe it was a squadron of orbital shock drop troopers? Or a tank? Or... As on cue the object hit the ground with a massive crash, and she felt the ground shake. It was far too large to be a squadron of troops, and as it opened she realized what it was. It began unfolding, limbs spiraling out and mechanical actuators moving to open itself up to its full size. It was a dull chrome color, with military markings painted on its sides and limbs. Metal plating enclosed most of its body, with only a small portion of its mechanical components revealed. Its legs were slightly folded to stabilize itself and to bring its center of gravity closer to the ground, and its feet looked like the hooves of a giant horse. Its main engines were hidden in its thighs, she surmised, which were much larger than any proportional animal or human had. The body was short and stocky, ending in a head that served as a sensor unit and looked almost like a gecko. A red line of light emanated from where its eyeline would be, probably where it saw. From its short stubby limbs protruded two massive swords, probably half a dozen meters in length. They glowed a deep red, almost like her holoks did. As they extended out to their full length, she could see each piston and actuator moving in tandem with one another, metal grinding against itself. Now it was standing on its own 2 feet and moving its limbs, probably to recalibrate itself in a new environment. This was the pinnacle of the magistrate's R&D division. No military contractor would be able to do this. Not without the proper engine, proper parts, and the proper code to run something like this. She had heard rumors about what they had been spending the research budget on, and Linhard speculated that it was something big. Billions of credits didn't just disappear like that. It was a mech in every sense of the word. She watched it steady itself, bracing its legs and leaning close to the ground. Then the mech leapt toward her, its massive legs launching itself into the air so fast she barely had time to react. It landed a few hundred meters away from her, and she knew that with another jump it would probably flatten her. How did it jump so damn far? And now that it was close up, only then did she realize how large it was. It was the size of a small building, not office building sized, but more like a schoolhouse. It towered above her, and while Edelgard normally felt a little short compared to her counterparts, now she felt tiny. Etched on its side was its call sign MX4. Ah, Queen of Flames. There you are. Though it was modulated and coming from the speakers of the mech, she knew exactly who it was. I've heard rumors of your prowess in combat. My head scientist asked me to gather combat data. I hope you'll be so happy as to oblige. As if to agree, the mech began walking closer, each step leaving a crater of dead grass and dirt behind. Thud. Thud. The sheer force of the footsteps reverberated in her head. They needed combat data, probably to perfect the combat parameters of the mech. Though in the past robots had human drivers, they were prone to error and emotion. Most of the time the computer was holding the reins anyway, the human just made larger decisions and brought unpredictability to the fray. One genius had the idea to take the human out of the cockpit and remotely control it, which had the upside of saving lives but the downside of damning the robot if the signal was jammed. So the solution, she guessed, was to create an advanced mech directive that would respond to external stimuli and follow commands. She supposed that it couldn't really learn. Since strong AI was punishable by death, it was simply a series of directives and waitings that were tweaked by researchers and technicians. And that meant since it couldn't adapt, there were weaknesses to exploit. She just had to find it. But none of that mattered if Edelgard was smashed to bits or sliced in half by the first few blows, so she quickly whipped out her axe and activated its blade. The Queen of Flames stared down the massive mech, unflinching and unmoving. It slowly lumbered toward her, each step covering several meters at a time. Her helmet visor tried to pinpoint weaknesses in its carapace, places that she could strike. Bernadetta was sending messages in fractured parts due to the signal jamming, and the minimap told her that her team was almost home free. But, she thought, I can do this on my own. So she clicked a small button behind her right ear that deactivated the HUD and sensor readouts, and now all she could see was the scene in front of her. It was odd readjusting to a world without flashing alerts and the soft buzz of comms, but it also felt oddly soothing. This was her time. She felt the weight of her armor, even if it had been artificially lightened due to the actuators at each joint. They allowed her to deliver extra strength in her blows and lift more than she could normally, which was perfect for fighting giant robots. Though she doubted the armor plating would do much versus a sword that could simply smush her like a bug if it didn't cleave her in half, its weight almost felt like a warm embrace. Edelgard moved into a fighting stance, shifting the weight of her body onto her front foot and keeping her back foot steady. Her right arm gripped her holoks as it hung to her side, and her left moved to her utility belt. The mech was now running, as the heavy thud of its steps got louder and louder. Its two swords hung dangerously low, almost dragging on the grass. It was getting closer and closer. 200 meters. She gripped her holoks tightly. 100 meters. Edelgard adjusted her stance just a little. 50 meters. It now towered above her, and she felt every fiber in her body scream to run. 20 meters. She wouldn't budge. Not one bit. 0 meters. As the mech rushed in to swipe at her with its left blade, Edelgard leapt over it and rolled under the main body of the mech. Its strikes were slow, and so she was able to dodge without too much trouble. Once she was under its carapace, she swung her holox as hard as possible into its left ankle, or at least what looked like its left ankle. Though it didn't sink in too far, the plating was now dented, and as the mech moved its leg to step on her, she quickly dashed to the right one and did the same. A large gash that steamed slightly was now present on both sides, and she knew that a few more strikes would at least cause meaningful damage. She rolled out the other side, and immediately the MX-4 rolled around to meet her. Its right blade slashed down at her, and she barely dodged its left, cutting a swath of grass in an attempt to reach her. She simply sidestepped the first and ducked under the second, bringing her axe around her as to avoid hitting herself with her own weapon. Edelgard circled around its left side, looking for an opening and keeping her eyes peeled for any sudden movement of the twin blades, glowing red in the darkness. If she was to be fighting at night, she could at least be glad that she was covered by the dark, her mostly black armor blending in. The mech, however, had no such protection. Small lights illuminated the area below it, and she could see the telltale glow of its fusion reactor shine through the cracks in its plating. For better or worse, it was bright enough to illuminate the area around it in a subtle blue tone, and the moonlight was enough to illuminate everything else. However, the one thing she did not expect was for it to bring its leg out in a sweep. Though it could not get as low to the ground as an actual human lest it fall to the ground in an awkward motion, it was enough to catch her off guard. Though she managed to dodge the brunt of the attack, at the end of its motion it barely caught Edelgard on her right side, and the force of the hit sent her soaring through the air. She landed a few meters away in the grass as she hit the ground with a thud, taking the brunt of the impact with her chest. Everything ached. She felt her breastplate to make sure she didn't break any ribs, and then realized that she was most certainly not out of the woods yet. The mech swung its sword at her body, taking advantage of the fact that she was laying on the ground only a few meters away. This time she managed to dodge by rolling sideways in a smooth motion, and quickly snatched her axe out of the dirt before she stumbled to her feet. Edelgard panted, taking a moment to breathe as she tried to assess the damage. Her right side burned, and her axe arm felt heavy as lead. She felt something trickle down her mouth, and it certainly wasn't her own drool. If she took a hit like that again, she was done. She added those damn legs to her list of things to keep track of, to dodge as if her life depended on it. Which it most certainly did. Though it was slow to get going, the MX-4 could move fast if it wanted to. So far its sword attacks were easily dodgeable, and she could probably just keep dodging all day. But she wondered who would get tired first, and to be frank, she had her money on the thing powered by a fusion reactor. It was the fact that getting in close meant that she could be hit by anything, and that was the only way she could deal damage. Her fingers closed in on a grenade attached to her belt, and Edelgard tried chucking it at the mech to see if it would have any effect. It exploded on its main body, and left barely a scratch other than a few scorch marks. Great. She was the prey, and this cold, unfeeling machine was the hunter. And she would be nothing more than a crimson stain blooming in the grass if she did not figure out a plan. Her left hand moved further down her utility belt, and closed around her grappling hook. It was a small, baton-like hook with amorphized steel end and carbon fiber cable tightly wound around its core. This could work. She steadied herself, as the mech moved into a fighting stance. Though its swords were carefully lowered, Edelgard knew that the second she moved it would be swiping at her in a series of frenzied attacks. But between its armored plates, she saw a small amount of exposed servos and what constituted as nerves, bundles of wires that relayed commands to each individual engine block. If she severed that, then perhaps she could cripple it, or at least slow its movement with a reduced capacity for attack. While its legs were heavily guarded, its arms were not, and she doubted the robot had enough reach to swat her off her shoulder. It was a gamble. But victory did not come without a little bit of luck involved. "All right," she muttered. "Bring it," she said to absolutely no one in particular. Her eyes locked with the gleaming red line that was supposed to be its eyes, hoping that whoever was overseeing its operation could see her right now. It was the closest thing to a standoff she would get. The robot lurched forward slightly to take a step, and Edelgard saw her opportunity. She reached out her left hand as her index finger pressed on the grapple release button, firing a hook that shot toward the robot's right arm. Air hissed out of the hook's handle as it unwinded to nearly its full length, and then hit the robot squarely on its right forearm. Though she was left with barely less than half of the grapple, she moved her finger over the retract button and held on for dear life with her left hand. As she shot up off the ground and into the air, the grappling line winding in with a satisfying thwip, she found herself soaring in the sky in quite a strange way. She supposed that this was the closest that one could get to flying outside of an airplane or a float unit. Though her helmet was firmly attached, she could nearly feel the wind blowing through her hair, past her ears and into the night sky. Hubert had always wanted to fly, she recalled morbidly. Was it a Pegasus or a Wyvern Knight that he wanted to be? And why did she not know what either of those two were? Once she was about halfway through the line being reeled and she tapped the release button, as the anchor locked into position in the robot's forearm detached with a small click. While the hook no longer reeled her and she could still feel it retracting into the batten, as she continued to shoot past the robot's right arm as it struggled to bring its sword up to intercept. Her momentum brought her flying behind it, until Edelgard quickly whipped around her grapple and shot it into the top of its back to reorient herself. Now she was soaring higher and higher as the hook brought her toward the mech's head, and she gave it a few seconds before she fully disengaged the grappling hook. She could feel it winding as she kept on flying, until her momentum upward came to a stop and she found herself coming back to Earth. But luckily Edelgard had planned for that, and a quick twist meant that she landed safely on the MX-4's right shoulder. It was a bit of a hard landing, and if her muscles weren't hardened and her joints cushioned with synthetic synovial fluid she might have broken something. But unfortunately for the massive mechanical beast she did not, and the solace of her combat boots dug into the metal plating as she moved her weight around to find traction. She planted her feet firmly as the mech below her heaved and swayed, no doubt trying to shake her off. It was like an elephant trying to shake off a flea, the sheer size of the elephant worked against it. Between what might have been its shoulder blades had it been human was a bundle of pipes and exposed servos, thrusting with each movement of the robot. These acted as a mechanical analog to muscle fibers, and any strand of metal or muscle would probably not hold up to her hollowks. Edelgard sprinted over and slashed through with all of her might, making sure to cut a deep gash and leave frayed wires sparking electricity everywhere. She felt the mech lurch as its right arm's movement slowed, but it did not stop it from raising its sword in defiance. She then slashed into the mech's nape, between two plates of armor, and she could hear the crunch of metal as her blade sliced through like a hot knife through butter. The MX-4 roared, which sounded like the eerie groaning of metal in an otherworldly rumble. She did not know robots could roar. But the intimidation factor was still there, and it was loud enough to throw her a little off balance. She barely managed to hold on as the robot got into a squatting position, which meant only one thing. Shit. She barely managed to leap away off of its shoulder as the robot lurched into the air, leaping several dozen meters away as she tried to get as much distance as possible. It landed on the ground with a massive crash, and so did she as she used her gauntlet to brace for impact and break her fall. She managed to roll a few meters without skewering herself with the blade of the hollowks, and Edelgard quickly leapt back up to her feet. The effects of her attack were quickly noticeable. Its movements seemed jerkier than usual, and its right arm was definitely not synchronized with its left. With a few more attacks, maybe to its legs, she could probably bring the whole machine down. It was lucky that it didn't have any heavy armament other than. She smelled ozone in the air. Edelgard barely had time to put up her hollow shield before the beast opened its maw and activated a massive plasma cannon, firing a beam of searing energy at her. Though her hollow shield was able to redirect it around her, the air burned an eerie shade of orange as it cut two massive burning lines behind her. The force was immense, and it was all she could do to keep herself upright as the sheer force of the blast put her in a kneeling position. And then she noticed the hollow shield getting thinner as its color began to fade, and she knew that if she didn't move she would be obliterated. With a quick flourish of what was left with her shield she deflected the beam slightly before sliding to the side, as the machine adjusted its angle to compensate. The shield shattered into nothingness, and now it was just her wits versus something hotter than the sun. This time she simply moved faster than the MX-4's head could rotate, and soon its plasma cannon fizzled out as a spent cartridge larger than her fell to the ground before her with a loud thud. But as she ran toward its right leg, she realized that its massive blade was about to come crashing upon her as it slammed its right arm down. She thought, have a very, very stupid idea. One that would probably end with her getting turned into red milk, but if it worked it would be worth it. Rather than simply dodge and lose her momentum, she simply grabbed her hallux in both hands and slammed the side of the blade as it came down over her head, deflecting its impact and throwing the mech off balance for a small bit. Edelgard knew that she had no chance of blocking something that probably weighed a few tons, but she could deflect it. Especially since she had already weakened its right arm and its movements were weak, and now the Queen of Flames had a weakness to exploit. She kept running her axe along the steel plating and carving a massive gash that was enough to cause the bottom half to fall uselessly to the ground. This was her chance, and now Edelgard slammed her hallux into its left foot with all her strength, hoping that she could bring it to its proverbial knees and cripple it. As her blade sunk in, she once again heard the groaning of metal as the robot lurched to its left side, only barely steadying itself by falling to one knee. Only sheer luck allowed her to roll out of the way before she was crushed, and now she was back in front of the robot looking for an angle of attack. Though it was recovering from the damage she had done to its bipedal systems, she knew that it would only be a matter of time before it redirected its power to another leg or found a way to stabilize itself. And, she mused, a wounded animal could often be the most dangerous in spite of its condition. Because a wounded animal had nothing to lose. Well, she thought. Here goes nothing. Edelgard sprinted toward the mech and leapt up onto its left knee, which had been firmly planted into the ground in an attempt to right itself. She vaulted up past its body onto its arm, which quickly moved to try to push her off. But she found that the higher she got the less the arm actually moved, and once she was nearly at its shoulder there was nothing it could do. Its other arm was too busy trying to stabilize its stance to do anything, and so she had the perfect opportunity to deal some real damage. She brought her hallux into the joint of its arm again and again and again, until the plating dented, revealing the delicate machinery underneath. The sound of her strikes reverberated through the robot, as she put more and more force into it as she got angrier and angrier. It felt almost cathartic, to keep on smashing something, until nothing was left but a gaping hole where its elbow might have been had it not been a giant mech the size of a small building. The MX-4 finally lurched to both feet, but it was too late. She now ran up to its shoulder before hacking away at the intersection between two plates like she did before deciding to pull out a small explosive device and ram it inside the gash she made. While it tried to shake her off my rapidly twisting and changing direction, she instead changed tactics and gripped her axe in two hands. She then leapt towards its back, and held her hallux as she slid down and sliced open the metal that constituted its spine. Now sparks were really flying, and there was a massive glowing red line where its back had once been as she landed to the ground with a small thump on both feet. And though the mech frantically tried to swipe at her with both blades, whirling around to face her, by now its movement was too slow to actually constitute a threat. And once she tapped a tiny protruding plate on her helmet, the explosive she had set before exploded in a fiery blast of gray and orange, metal shrapnel raining from the sky as she swatted away a couple of the larger shards without any issue. Most of the explosion had been internal, and as a result once the smoke settled she saw that the explosion had left its left arm hanging on by only a few strands of twisted metal. And even that didn't last, as the metal stretched and bent until the entire arm from the shoulder down came crashing to the ground with a satisfying crash, the energy sword attached to it blinking a few times before sputtering out. Flames coursed through the body, and though she heard the whoosh of its fire suppression systems activating, she guessed that the MX-4 was not long for this world. Edelgard mentally corrected her comparison she made before. She was the hunter. And that, she thought, was her quite oversized prey. And the rules of nature dictated that she put it out of its misery. With a flourish of her left hand she shot the grapple at its eyeline, and she heard the satisfying clink of the hook embedding into its head. And with a quick press she shot up into the sky, releasing only when she was sufficiently high enough and carried enough momentum for a single strike. She was high enough in the sky that she felt she could sing with happiness, and Edelgard never sang. Now she let go of her grapple baton, letting it retract back as the momentum ran out and she came crashing down. But she now gripped her hallux with both hands, and her body was arched in a way to deliver a terrible blow as she brought her legs back and raised her arms above her head. As the head came into view and she was close enough to touch it, she brought her axe upon the MX-4's central processing unit with all the force Edelgard could muster. The force of the Queen of Flames, the force of Monica, the force of Dimitri, even the force of the memories she did not understand, all of these were brought into her strike. And with the satisfying sound of metal cleanly slicing through metal, her axe cut straight through its head and sliced further into its body, as she felt the full force of her impact through her arms and into her spine. The sheer force of the attack split its head into two, and now it came tumbling down to the ground along with her. Edelgard landed on the ground axe first, and barely managed to land upright after her strike. The robot had clearly gone offline, and now the only sound she heard was sparking and whirring machinery slowly getting quieter and quieter. The MX-4 lay in pieces, and she had only suffered a few minor injuries to boot. Unfortunately, she had also destroyed the clearing and a decent chunk of the forest in her battle. But that could be regrown. Snatching her grappling hook from its lifeless body, she simply tossed her highest yield explosive at it and kept on walking. She felt her axe's blade shimmer into non-existence as she cut the power, letting it fold back in on itself as she snapped both her hook and her hallux onto her utility belt. Above her, she could hear the telltale signs of a helicopter whirring overhead, probably to assess the damage. It shone a spotlight on her head, probably meant to single her out and draw her attention. If she were in a more joking manner, or if Casper had rubbed off on her more, she might have flipped at the finger. But she just kept walking, past the clearing and onto the main road, and to her hover bike. "Drop the weapon and stand down," shouted a loudspeaker overhead. But his voice was drowned out by the sound of a massive explosion behind her that she had set off, and she was dimly aware that metal shrapnel was flying everywhere. But Edelgard was far enough away that she didn't even bother turning around. The helicopter quickly veered away, no doubt to call for reinforcements. She pressed a switch on her helmet and its HUD systems whirred back to life. Immediately the worried face of her operator burst onto her screen, as her cheeks reddened and her facial expression relaxed once she connected properly. "Boss. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she muttered. "Is Casper and Petra?" She cursed herself for forgetting about Petra. "Are they okay?" They only got out a few minutes ago. But they're on their way back. I think. You stalled pretty well. Okay. Give them my best regards. But boss. You just fought a giant robot. A MX prototype. That was so cool. Are you okay? Are you hurt? You blew it up, didn't you? It's just so cool. Thanks, Bernie. I'll see you later. Edelgard clicked off the communication line, and she took a deep breath. To conquer the magistrate's secret weapon had been a burst of emotion, a chance to let free the repressed desire to crush anything that stood in her way. It brought her immense pride to bring it down alone, without the aid of any software or operator. But for some reason her victory felt a bit hollow. She almost felt like winning was worse, because she guessed that her fight was probably being analyzed and dissected at that very moment. Had she given her enemies the key to defeating her? What Hubert had said before about gathering combat data really gotten to her. Hubert von Vestra got to her. Who was he, really? Enemy? Possible ally? Somewhere in between. If he was truly loyal to her, or had he ever been loyal at all? Edelgard swore a silent oath that she would unravel the secret of her oldest friend at all cost. And, she thought, she would figure out what the hell these damned memories were. Because if she lost her mind and her memories of her youth, then Edelgard von Hresvelg was truly dead. With a quick raise of her leg she leapt onto the bike and gunned the engine, blue energy shooting out of the bottom and causing it to hover a few inches off the ground. She knew that there was probably a squadron or two of Imperial enforcers chasing her now that Hubert's little side project had failed. And sure enough, she could tell based on the telltale radio chatter on the same encrypted lines they tended to use that she was quite the hot commodity, so her bike streaked across the lonely district of Remire and towards salvation. The roads and bridges began to fade into nothing but a blur as she swerved through the night faster than even the helicopters could track. She was much faster, and it only took a few clever evasive maneuvers before she stumbled into the Remire entrance to the abyss and set off into the tunnels toward home. Her real home, because she had no desire to head to the hideout right now. And though she felt guilty about Petra and poor Vitus, all she wanted to feel was the sweet embrace of sleep. She wanted to simply bandage her wounds, plop down onto her soft bed and pray that the nightmares did not take her. Once she had managed to park and enter her home's hidden entrance through a quick iris scan, her body was moving almost on autopilot. She took a hot shower, bandaged her wounds, grabbed a bottle of vodka and drank as much as she could before practically dropping into her bed from exhaustion. It was all she could do to avoid passing out instantly, and she was dimly aware that an outside world existed. Her mind was basically mush, and at this point she wondered if she could even spell her own name. Sleep. Sleep sounded good. I, Edelgard thought, am going to sleep. And then I am going to kill Yuri. Chapter 9, A Reason to Fight. Edelgard was awoken by a buzzing. It was not in her head, since she felt the table vibrate next to her. Which meant it had to be her holodeck. You have an incoming call from Dorothea Arnold, said something distantly. She groaned, and put her pillow back over her eyes so that the light wouldn't blind her. Put her on, was her muffled reply. Eddie, said a very cheery voice. Are we still on for lunch today? No, was her very quiet reply. Are you okay? It's not like you to be so tired. I just wanna sleep, Edelgard moaned. Hungover, said Dorothea. She laughed. Very out of character even for you, Edie. Well, let's reschedule for tomorrow, then, dear. Okay. Okay. Oh dear. She's a lot worse than I thought. Well, good night then. The call cut out, and Edelgard rolled over onto her side. Her face was still buried into her pillow. She just felt so tired, and soon she began to dream. Professor? Edelgard asked. Oh, Edelgard knew she was dreaming. For some reason her brain retained her consciousness, and she understood that she was not really here. And yet still she knew that she was not in control, even if it did feel like a lucid dream. It was like she was a prisoner in her own body. And she used the word her in the loosest sense. Still, at least it was a boon that she was able to recall her dreams as they were. Almost as if they weren't really dreams but instead memories. Dimly she could recall certain things about this life. She was in an officer's academy? She looked down at her sleeves, complete with bronze cuffs and her perfectly creased black blazer. Her collar was a bit tight for her liking, and she wasn't really sure what the weird cravat-like white fabric was on the front. It was quite the take on a uniform. Edelgard in this world definitely shared her own sense of style. A little gaudy, but stylish. In front of her was her professor. She shivered mentally. Just saying the word professor brought up all sorts of emotions, and sorting through her mind she found that it evoked a warm fuzzy feeling in her heart. And yet she did not remember her name. Her outfit was striking by any measure, a black top with pink trim, and a symbol that she did not recognize etched into it. A short black skirt stretched into leggings and combat boots, and Edelgard couldn't help but pause to admire. Well, admire was the wrong word. She could feel her counterpart sneak a peek and then flick back upwards. Fortunately, because it was a dream, she did not have to do so, so she simply stared for a bit and then moved on as well. Sure, with her ample chest and toned body her professor was quite conventionally attractive. But it was her face that confused her the most. Her smiles were quite subdued, and she recalled that they were rare and far between. Sometimes her professor's blue eyes looked like they were staring through her rather than at her, and there was a certain calmness that most people lacked. And of course, her turquoise hair meant that she could pretty much always be picked out of a crowd. Edelgard could only describe her as mysterious. And when she thought of her she felt a deep curiosity. Some of it was attraction, but the other was simply a deep longing, beyond any romantic or licentious impulses. These feelings were clearly quite messy, and she definitely did not envy her counterpart. In this memory, she was what, about 18? Edelgard did not want to remember how much of a hot mess she was when she was once that age, and all things considered in this world she seemed to be doing just fine. Hello, Edelgard, was her professor's reply. It was monotone, but she recalled that it was just how she spoke and wasn't a sign of boredom. Do you need something from me? Why was she blushing? To be in love again, she mused. It was cute. I was wondering if you liked tea, she said. I have a few bags of crescent moon that I'd like to share with you. There was a small hint of a smile on her professor's face. I would love to, Edelgard. When are you free? Well, considering you're working us ragged, replied Edelgard, tomorrow at noon. It's a deal. The hint of a smile turned into a small one. I've got to get to the training grounds. I'll see you tomorrow for morning classes. Of course. Thank you, my teacher. Edelgard bowed slightly, and the two walked past each other and went on their respective ways. Her cheeks burned. You can come out now, Edelgard said to absolutely no one in particular. Behind a stone pillar was Hubert, and he quite literally stepped out of its shadow into the main path. No wonder why people thought he was creepy. She chuckled in her mind. It seemed like Hubert von Vestra was creepy in every world. Like Edelgard, he was quite well dressed, except instead of red he just went with even more black and white gold accents. She noted the white gloves that covered his hands, and she wondered if that was to keep his hands clean or to keep what was under a secret. That went quite well, Lady Edelgard. I dare say that it went as well as you had hoped. Thank you, Hubert, she replied. I don't have much practice in these sorts of things. Neither do I, he said sheepishly. But besides, it is not simply about a simple crush that you are asking our professor out for tea time. Of course not, she said abruptly. I will ascertain whether or not she can be an ally for our cause. Yes. Do not let your personal feelings cloud your judgment. She glared at him. This is coming from you of all people, Hubert. Lady Edelgard, he said. You cannot lose sight of why we are here. Edelgard sighed. Yes. And if she is not willing to be an ally, then I will deal with her. Something in the back of Edelgard's mind struggled. As if she was truly concerned about her professor's safety, that she would have done anything to protect her. These were quite complicated feelings. Was it love, if she could even call it that? Or was it simply the curiosity of a young girl who latched onto the comfort of someone she looked up to? And Edelgard still did not understand the whole story. It was as if she was thinking through a fog. She could not recall much about her prior memories, except that she managed to recognize things that she spotted. Something in her knew exactly who was who, as if she had lived this life before. But the finer details eluded her. How did she get from student to emperor? What exactly had happened to the Edelgard of her memories to turn her hair white, and was it the same as what had happened in her own world? And finally, who or what was this professor that she loved so dearly? She'd have to piece it together as soon as she woke up. So she willed herself to wake. Edelgard woke to find that she was not crying, which was all too rare these days. The last few nights she had been waking to find that her face was caked with dried tears, and that her heart felt heavy for some reason. The aching in her body after her big fight had gone away, perhaps in part due to her healing factor. Unfortunately, she couldn't say the same about her headache, and the dull throbbing somewhere in the back of her head would not stop for a while. It felt less like a hangover and more like she was recovering from a mild concussion. She rubbed her eyes. Hey, what time is it? It is currently 5:30. She shot up. Oh. Her covers scattered to the floor as she leapt up and onto the ground. Throwing together a light outfit and scrambling towards the basement, Edelgard made a mental list of what she had to do. And since she had slept for approximately 15 hours, she now was running way behind schedule. She didn't even bother to check her holodeck and all of the missed calls, because she knew that she was going to be quite busy catching up. Normally she would be adjusting her makeup, doing her morning workout, and setting her schedule for the day while sipping a nice cup of Morphi's coffee. She might have even checked out the news and looked for a disturbance in Remire district, and Edelgard wondered what the headline might have been. Crazy woman takes on building-sized robot. Or, as the magistrate probably would have spun it, building-sized robot leaves smear on pavement. Edelgard admittedly missed not having responsibilities. If she could just sleep in and watch holodramas, or lazily lounge around her empty house all day, she probably would. But it also felt wrong. It almost felt like every minute of downtime she had was time she could spend hunting down her enemies and uncovering the secrets of New Fodlan. And while she did like spending time as a superficial socialite, it was exhausting. Damned responsibilities. She wondered if Dima would even bother with the double life she lived. Don't forget your toast, shouted her robo-butler. As she passed the kitchen table she snatched it off the counter and bit into it. With said toast between her teeth she continued down the stairs into the basement, all the way into the armory and ever closer to the darkness of abyss. After an uneventful hoverbike ride, Edelgard took her helmet off and stared up at the neon sign that lit up Leclerc's. Though the usual mask she had under obscured her facial features, today she wore a long-sleeved red dress with black tights under. Though unlike the outfits she wore out to her lunches with Dorothea, her clothing was quite tactical. Woven into the lining were titanium and carbon fiber strands meant to stop most weapons from cutting through. Though it would stop traditional blades, it still had a hard time with plasma and hollow weapons, so she supposed the key was not getting hit. Her baton was neatly tucked on her right thigh under a fold of her skirt, and her boots concealed hidden ceramic knives that could easily be flicked out. Even in her brassiere were a couple smoke devices meant to get away, and though it was a bit tight for her liking she felt secure knowing she had insurance in case she needed to get away. Edelgard was acutely aware of the effect she had on others in her outfit. She was never really the flirty type, and Dorothea had once called her denser than a neutron star after a party where she had apparently been hit on quite a few times and didn't realize until after the fact. And it wasn't like she could exactly ask her friend about the art of seduction. But looking good was a lot easier, and she could disarm any questions with a winning smile and a twirl. It was easy since the top half of her face was covered in shadow, there was no hiding the disdain in her eyes when she had to use her femininity. And instead of wearing a hood, she used a small hollow projector to turn it crimson red. While she did not particularly care for a red hair color, Edelgard knew that it was probably better than having rumors of a platinum-haired girl swirl around Abyss. Balthus was there. Again. She surmised that if it were anybody else, she would be in without a problem. But with him, he always needed something. What did he even need, with his massive physique, reputation, and the throngs of both men and women crawling on him after he cleaned up a fight? She wondered. "Oh hey, mystery lady," he said, raising his hand in greeting. "Lookin' damn fine today." "Ah, thanks, Balthus. Say, where's your boss tonight?" He gestured inside. "In his office." She quickly moved inside, but his massive hand grabbed hers to stop her. "Someone's in a rush today." "I'm not in a mood for games today," she said. Shit. She had let her emotions get the better of her. And if her cover was blown now, or if she had to fight Balthus. "Oh? And why's that?" he replied. His grip was tight and his hands were big, but oddly enough he did not make much of an effort when she broke free with a simple shake. "It's business," said Edelgard nonchalantly. "And if you know what's good for you then you can stop prying." "Feisty," chuckled Balthus. "I'll only let you go in if you surrender your weapon." Edelgard rolled her eyes. Dimly recalling that he couldn't see the fact that she was rolling her eyes, she elected to instead shake her head in defeat. Reaching into the folds of her dress, she whipped out her baton and passed it to the bouncer. He took it gingerly in his hands and it disappeared somewhere down his suit and those massive pectorals of his. Ugh. She would have to wash it later. "And before you even think of trying it," she said, "there's a biometric lock on it." "Wouldn't even dare, mystery lady," he said, flashing a grin. "Go on in." He grabbed the door and swung it open, and Edelgard sauntered inside the wretched hive of villainy that was Leclerc's. As she walked past the counter and tables filled with laughing people, she ignored everything and kept on walking, blood pumping in her ears. Her eyes were firmly focused on the small stairway that led up to Yuri's office, covered by a curtain emblazoned with Almiran designs. Edelgard could certainly feel the glares of others on her, both out of desire and of curiosity. But she simply kept on walking, as she reached her gloved hand out to move the curtain out of her way. Up she went, her boots clacking on the wooden steps. She knocked on the door in front of her. On top was a little placard that said, "Yuri Leclerc." Edelgard made a mental note to rip it down on her way out. The door creaked open slightly. No doubt he had a camera to see his visitor already, so she wasn't really expecting him to be surprised. "Hello, Beauty-Dash." Before Yuri had time to react she rushed into his office, slamming the door into the wall so hard it bounced off by the doorknob and closed once more. She lunged forward for the mop of purple hair that stood in front of her, grabbing him by his throat and lifting him up with one hand. Though she was shorter, Her boots gave her a bit of height, and that was how she ended up lifting Yuri Leclerc several inches off the floor as he gasped for air. "You sent my men to die," she growled. "KGHH," Yuri struggled in her grasp, limbs flailing. Though she wasn't applying enough pressure with her right hand to kill him, putting all of his weight on his throat had to hurt. So she lifted him a little higher. He was lighter than she thought, and so she barely even broke a sweat. She noticed that his right hand was slipping a little too close to his belt, and so she slapped his hand away as a dagger clattered to the floor beside her. "We found your scout in pieces," Edelgard said. "One of my men died, Yuri." Though he could not see, her glare was practically murderous. His eyes were frozen in abject terror, and though he still struggled he seemed to be panicking. "So goddess help me, your explanation better be good. Start talking." "Can't breathe," he croaked. Edelgard dropped him, and he crumpled onto the floor in a heap. His gasps were frantic and sporadic, but he was still breathing. She heard a couple loud thumps on the door, and before she had time to move the door cracked and the large frame of Balthus walked in. His eyes moved to Edelgard, and then his boss lying on the floor. He balled his fists and moved into a fighting stance, as Edelgard tensed up. "How dare you lay a finger dash?" Yuri coughed. "Easy, Balthus. It's okay." Though his clothing had been ruffled, his skin was returning to his normal color and his expression went back to his usual confident yet mysterious self. He was rubbing through the bruises she had left on his throat, and groaned. "I definitely deserved that." Balthus raised an eyebrow. "Yuri. It's okay, Balthus. Leave me be for now." His eyes widened. "But Dash," he said, clearly gesturing to Edelgard. "It's all right." He waved him off, and Balthus stomped down the stairs, though with her keen sense of hearing she noted that he didn't go much further than that. She supposed that if she really did end up killing Yuri, she would have to fight her way out. And Edelgard was prepared to do that, but as much as she relished a good fight she didn't really want to destroy the only bar she actually liked going to. "Take a seat," Yuri said, as he got to his feet and sat behind his desk. It was a large mahogany desk with a lot of papers on it, along with a few holographic screens and a scanner on top. A pen nib and some ink were present, and she was reminded that Yuri did have a penchant for stationery. She made a mental note of that if she ever needed to give a present to Yuri. That is, assuming he lived past the day. A large bookshelf was behind him, with titles that she glanced through but did not really recognize. She guessed that Yuri most likely had some form of secret behind there, whether it was a safe, secret passage, or maybe even a plasma cannon meant to kill intruders. And though she had visited his office a few times before, she never had the opportunity to pry and see what was behind there. Edelgard decided to play along for the time being, so she took one of Yuri's rolling chairs set to the side and rolled herself into a position facing him. She took a seat, glaring daggers at him all the way. Yuri flinched a little, and she knew that even if her face was still covered in shadows her presence was still somewhat terrifying. "I'll have to admit," he said. "You're impressive. You caught me off guard." "Wasn't too hard," she replied. "You were distracted." "TCH. It won't happen again." She noticed that his dagger had disappeared, and she guessed that Yuri had quite a few surprises hidden in his desk. "So, Yuri." Her tone turned serious. "Spill." He sighed. "Where do I even begin?" He put his feet up on the desk, and Edelgard instinctively rolled her chair a little bit further back. Those, she noted, were very expensive shoes. Still, she was not planning on licking anybody's boots today. "I heard rumors that there were way too many supply trucks heading to a certain section of Remire. So we put a tracker on one of them, and by the time they swept for it one of the merc cells had already sniffed out the location." "Ah. So it was one of your cells." "I didn't say it was mine." "Let's dispense with the formalities, Savage Mockingbird," she sneered. "I know exactly what you are capable of, and what you have built these past years." Edelgard was referring to the infamous figure among the criminal underworld of Abyss, who had his hands in more than one illegal gambling scheme and mercenary racket. Though a formal arrest warrant had never been made out, everyone knew that he was responsible for quite a few of the incidents that had recently struck Abyss. And though he was not the head of the criminal underworld, far from it, he did carry a reputation. What had given Yuri up was that as the Mockingbird, he was too compassionate. He went out of his way to help people, make sure innocents stayed out of danger, and kept their business out of Leclerc. And so it only took a couple drinking games to start suspecting Yuri Leclerc, bartender of his namesake bar, was in fact a devious criminal mastermind. Actually, she assumed that many people knew, that was why people came to Leclerc's to talk business. I could say the same of you, Queen of Flames, he said mockingly. She shrugged. Doesn't take a genius to figure that one out. He sighed. I'm not gonna reply to that. At any rate, well, when they found the farmhouse, they went for a raid through what they thought was a hidden entrance. Thought is the key word. Got absolutely slaughtered. Slaughtered. Well, they got cut to bits by enforcers. Saw the footage myself. Oh. Were you imagining something different? She moved her lips to speak, remembering the beast that lurked in the depths, and then hesitated. Not the point. Go on. One of the mercs had a wife. He grimaced, think it was Laisha? She was working for me as an operative, gathering intelligence. She told me that she would do anything to find out what had happened to her husband. And so I told her what had happened. And that under no circumstances should she ever go there. And so she went there. Yuri shrugged. It's only natural. And so she did go. But at least she was recording the whole process along the way. She snuck in, you know. Got pretty far, and in her line of work you have to be pretty damn good at disabling cameras. So she ducked the cameras, managed to get past the guards. Scanned a couple documents. Then she got caught. How? Oh, she lingered too long at her husband's body. She saw him. Or at least what was left of him. And so they dragged her away, kicking and screaming. The last thing I saw before the cam shut off was the sound of a blade swinging down on her. But that doesn't explain it, she muttered. Explain what? Yuri asked. I found her body in chunks. Oh. They must have fed her to the beast. The beast. Yuri leaned in closer, taking his legs off the table. You know I still want to kill you. Yuri rolled his eyes. I thought we got past the whole killing part. Edelgard scoffed. Yeah? Keep talking and I might just skip to that step. But her shoulders tensed, and her body language betrayed her real intentions. We ran into a beast. Like a bear. A bear, she spat, would not have killed one of my men and injured who knows how many more. The thing was the size of a tank. Resistant to most weaponry. One of the magistrate's experiments. She raised an eyebrow. Do you know something? I have heard rumors, he said carefully, about the biological experiments they've been performing. Why else would they transport large quantities of regenerative biots and mutagenic mass? So you followed the supply lines? Yes. Well, she growled. Next time, before you send my men to confirm rumors of experiments, how about you go see for yourself first next time? Humph, he said, spinning around in his chair. I had already sent in one team. And you, he said, pointing at her, are technically one of my teams. I am my own master, she reminded Yuri. And my team is loyal to me. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. Well, will they still be loyal if you weren't paying them what they pay? She shrugged. I tend to inspire loyalty. Yeah, destroying a Orbis-class mechanized beast with nothing but a Holox would probably do that. There was an unmistakable grin on his face. Edelgard blushed slightly. I was beginning to think that no one had heard about it. Oh, it wasn't on the news, he chuckled. Just that the enforcers have been buzzing about it for the whole day. That the Queen of Flames wasn't human, that she ripped the thing in half, blah blah blah. Can I see the combat footage? No. Damn. Yuri shook his head. Just a bit. I'll put it on the net later. Now it was Edelgard's turn to grin. For what it's worth, Yuri said. I'm sorry for your loss. I can make sure that his family is well compensated. His tone had a bit of sadness to it. She knew that the savage Mockingbird had a reputation for being a heartless bastard, but the man before him was all too human. It was a weakness to be exploited. Thank you, Yuri. And I'm sorry for choking you earlier. Really, he said. She chuckled. Yeah, no. You did say you deserved it. Yuri grinned. Although next time, I'd be surprised if you made it 3 feet without getting stabbed. Is that a threat? No. Just a sign that we are going to have a very beautiful partnership. She ignored that. Did you scrounge up anything on Project Sethline? Now it was time for Yuri to smile. Do you read? Not really. For fun, I mean. Most of the reading I have to do. Figures. What merc respects the good OL classics, huh? Well, anyway, I found a Sethline in one of the old history books of Fodlan. Might as well take a look. Yuri got up out of his seat, grabbing onto a very worn brown leather book. He tapped the ID marking on the front cover with his glove, and something whirred to life on his holographic screen. Edelgard then noticed the text she received over her holodeck. The life and death of Siros, she asked. Oh, it's not really translated well, Yuri said. And of course, I can't give you the original. This copy is just a replica, but it's still fragile. So the ebook will have to suffice. Thank you. She tapped the notification away on her wrist and looked at Yuri, his facial expression blank. Or was it pensive? She turned to walk away, but Yuri cleared his mouth. Ahem. Edelgard turned back around to look at him. I understand you're still a bit miffed about the whole thing, he said. But you know that we have to work together. I'm not asking you to do it out of some sense of friendship. He looked at her solemnly, his light purple eyes staring holes through the back of her skull. She then realized a little late that Yuri's eyes were the same color as hers. Strange. It was quite a pretty color. We need each other. We may not work for the same goals, but pragmatism tells us that our best option is to trust each other. Even if I hate the word trust. Edelgard paused, unsure what to say. She locked eyes with him. I don't need anybody, she said dismissively. But, as she paused, I have to admit that good things have come from our partnership. But you will be more upfront with me from this point on. Yes, sir, he said mockingly. Let me know if you find out anything important. And try not to fight any giant robots tonight, will ya? Or at least wait for me next time. Edelgard turned around to walk out, and perhaps to hide her smile. Oh, that Yuri Leclerc would be the death of her. Could he be trusted? Probably not. But at least he was better than the rest of the rats down in Abyss. And so he lived another day. By the time she had gotten back down to the main floor, Balthus had already returned to his post. She could feel him glaring at her murderously all the way from the entrance, but Edelgard simply ignored him and sat down at the counter. She ordered a couple shots of vodka, telling the bartender to put it on her tab, and stared at the hollow screen behind the bartender. It was an address by the God Emperor Nemesis to his people. She balled her fists. Luckily she had already put down the shot of vodka, or there would be broken glass, vodka, and maybe even a little bit of blood all over the counter. Her reason to fight stared her right in the eyes. The display was a tiny bit blurry, but she could see his unmistakable form standing in front of his golden throne. He was big, far bigger than any normal human could have been without augmentations. Official reports said that he was around 8 feet tall, but he was not lanky at all. His massive breastplate and arms that were probably about as wide as her entire torso were clues that underneath his armor the God Emperor was a monster of a man, if he could even be called a man. His armor shone gold, reflecting the skylight above, complete with black accents between plates. His left shoulder pauldron was decorated with the insignia of the will of the God Emperor, a strange twirling symbol that kids liked to draw in elementary school before their teachers slapped their hands for doing so. And then she remembered. It was a crest, she thought. The crest of flames. The same one that she had conjured when fighting her little brother, in a dream that felt so long ago. How had she not realized it earlier? And why could she conjure that symbol with her own blood, if it was the symbol of a different realm entirely? Though his left shoulder pauldron was much more ornate and larger, the right still shone a bright gold. She did not recognize the symbols that were etched into his armor, tapestries of wars that she did not even recall and scenes that she did not understand. Perhaps some research would have to make do. His gauntlets were massive by any standards, black spikes jutting out from the sides as if to stab anybody who dared stand next to him. A massive girdle covered where his torso was, emblazoned with a skull and decorated in a much more muted shade of gold. From it hung his sword, a massive greatsword whip that could extend to cover more area with strikes and then solidify to cut through anything. The rest of him was a little more subdued, although his greaves still glowed golden and his boots were probably twice as big as his. Behind him, a long purple cape flowed, fluttering in the artificial wind. Edelgard looked closely at his face, and she resisted her urge to punch the screen. Years of battle had turned his hair white, although it was similar to hers in that it lacked the sickliness and frailty of old age but instead seemed to nearly glow. Scars crisscrossed his face, although at this point it was only scar tissue and served only to give him some texture. It was a rugged sort of handsome that almost reminded her of the Blade Breaker. But unlike Geralt, his eyes were ice-cold and commanding. His glare was expressionless, as he prepared to address 100 billion people across a solar system. If the stories were true and he truly had lived more than 1,000 years, then he most likely had seen it all already. Nothing could faze him, and thus he spoke with the gravitas of someone who held life and death itself in his hands. People of the Empire, I have come here to speak of great tidings. The great space colony of Bladdid has completed construction last month. Edelgard wanted to spit. To name such a colony after Dima's bloodline, an insult to their memory. She supposed that the oaf Rufus Bladdid himself was responsible, who was technically her step-uncle and also held the bloodline of Bladdid. Though on paper he was simply an asteroid mogul, she had long suspected that he had ulterior motives for his work. His wife, Cornelia, worked directly for the magistrate. And to name an entire colony after them, after killing members of the Bladdid family in the tragedy of Duskur. It is a testament, he roared, to the glory of our empire. That we are able to conquer any obstacle in our way, from the earth itself to the stars. The God Emperor's presence alone was commanding, and his voice even more so. The bar was transfixed, and few dared to continue their conversation or even play billiards. We are humanity. Not bound by the petty squabbles of those who would dare to even think of disrupting the march of progress. His eyes stared into the camera, and Edelgard swore that he was staring directly at her. Humanity does not deserve its place in the stars. Not until we pour our blood, sweat, and tears, giving our souls to the cause of the greater good. We shall conquer all, under my banner. I led the unification war because humanity divided would be staring down the gate of extinction in only a few years. The God Emperor took a step forward. So to those who would dare raise the flag of rebellion against me, he said, against the Empire itself, he curled his hand into a fist. We will hunt you down and crush you without hesitation. We will wipe your bloodline from this universe, and erase your very existence. Starting with you. His hand gestured toward the camera, and Edelgard could swear he mouthed the word Queen. His biannual address continued, but all Edelgard could hear was a loud pounding in her ears. It wasn't out of fear. No. It was out of rage. She had sworn she would kill him. Watch him personally gargle on his own blood as she plunged her own axe through his throat. He had been there. It was the only time she had ever seen the God Emperor Nemesis in the flesh, watching. He simply watched, his massive form standing in a corner, as the executioner's axe rang out again and again. Each time it came down, a Hresvelg's head rolled to the floor. He stood there, with a blank expression on his face. Unmoving. It was almost as if he had swung the axe himself. Do what you wish with their children, he had said, before disappearing into his transport convoy. Edelgard could only watch, blood dripping from her wounds, as she watched what had once been her hope abandon her to a world of pain. And every time she saw him, the feelings that she had tried to suppress so many years ago kept rising up to the surface. The feelings of anger, of sadness, and of pure uncontrollable rage. If those came out here. Edelgard shuddered. She would become more of a monster than she already was. She got up, barely saying a word as she stomped out. Balthus tried blocking the way, but she merely reached her hand out. He sighed, reaching into his suit and dropping her hollowks into her hand. Pull a stunt like that again, he said, and I'll kill you. You can try, she replied curtly. Have a nice night, Balthus. Her hoverbike whirred to life as she got on, and as she drove she found herself thinking about what she was really fighting for, about the reason why she was the Queen of Flames. Was it to avenge Dimitri and the rest of her family? Was it to create a better world? Or was it? She recalled the girl in the tank. Flame. Her mind flashed to an image of a beautiful woman, the one she saw in her dream. My teacher. Was she fighting for something she didn't truly understand? It was hard to understand what she felt in the moment. She pressed her free hand to her temple, feeling the incoming headache. She had to get it together. To get her revenge, she had plans laid out. To incite a rebellion was quite the delicate task, and if she got too bloodthirsty she would never get what she desired. To reshape the world might have been her goal if she was naive as she was when she was a child, but now Edelgard understood that mankind was capable of terrible things. In truth, she cared less about giving people a voice and more about burning it all down. It was selfish, but that was what she really believed. Vengeance. That was her reason to fight. She could sell the create a better world part, but she knew what she truly craved. And she would never be satisfied until the God Emperor Nemesis's head rolled at her feet and her axe dripped with his blood. Not until Edelgard von Hresvelg could crush his head under her boot into a million pieces, and feed what was left to the worms of New Fodlan. Chapter 10, Missing Pieces. Edelgard was greeted by a bone-crushing hug from a small woman. Ow, she muttered. Then Bernadetta punched her in her arm, probably as hard as she could since it simply bounced off her bicep. Why you weren't answering? Anne, we were all worried about you. Bernadetta's voice was high-pitched and indignant, as she continued to hammer away at her boss. You turned off your comms, you stupid suicidal blockhead idiot. Edelgard let go of her operator gently and moved her far enough so that she couldn't strike again. Bernadetta was dressed in a little dark green hoodie, hints of her messy hair peeking underneath the hood. Her headset hung on her neck loosely, and she looked like she was about to cry. She sighed. I'm sorry. I should have called. You're such a meanie dash, Bernadetta caught herself. I mean, boss. Where's Petra? She ignored the slip-up and went right back to business. In the medical room, Bernie replied. Mercedes gave her an examination over call. Why didn't you just bring her to the clinic? There was no time. That's what they said. So we brought her here, and luckily, well, Flesh knows enough first aid to stabilize her. Then Mercedes took a look, she shivered a little, probably recalling the memory of a bloodied friend. Hey. She patted Bernadetta's head. Slow down. It's all right. Her operator nodded in reply. I'm gonna go check up on them, okay? Be back in a few. Bernie flipped her headset back on and practically jumped back into her chair, pretending to be staring at the hollow screens before her. Oh, she wasn't very happy with her boss. It broke her heart to make Bernie upset, but the only thing Edelgard could do was to just give her a bit of space. After all, she was only upset because she cared. And that was more than she could say about most people when it came to Edelgard's well-being. She stepped onto the walkway that led to the medical room, her boots clanging against the steel that ran across the abandoned station. This would lead her to a series of old maintenance rooms that she used as storage rooms, temporary quarters, and in dire circumstances a medical bay. The main hallway was carefully tiled in white and beige, which she herself had painted in an attempt to cover up the decaying decor of the old subway. In front of her was another sliding door, and she pressed her iris to the scanner on her left. With a pneumatic hiss the door opened, and Edelgard carefully walked in. It was mostly empty, save for a couple beds and a few racks of supplies. In the corner was a medical bed connected to a machine and 4 drip, slowly beeping to confirm that the person connected was in fact still alive. She traced the machinery to an arm and its owner, lying unconscious on a bed. Her head was wrapped in bandages, and the rest of her was covered under medical sheets. Petra McNeary's eyes were closed tightly, but her mouth was moving. She was muttering incoherent thoughts, as even in her sleep her facial expression was locked in a grimace. Though she suspected the 4 had a component of morphine, no doubt it was more of a mental issue than a physical one. In between muttered sentences and phrases, all Edelgard could hear was the beeping of her life support as it pulsed in time with her heart. The former princess of Brigid and one of the deadliest assassins in the system was reduced to nothing more than a quiet woman wrapped in sheets, babbling in a language that Edelgard did not understand. Next to her was a chair that contained the form of Amina Weisbaum, who had one hand holding Petra's left hand gingerly and the other staring intently at a hollow screen. She had sea green eyes and a hair tied neatly in a bun, wearing a t-shirt of a popular rock band. Though she was not a woman of many words, from what she did know Amina had once been a soldier of some sorts in Brigid before she came here. Though the veracity of her file was difficult to verify, it was Petra that had personally vouched for her. Amina rewarded that loyalty by serving as Petra's lieutenant ever since she officially joined forces with the Queen of Flames. She had no problem voicing her hesitation about certain plans, and Edelgard was not blind to the fact that she followed Petra's orders, not hers. The only reason why Edelgard saw an issue with her conduct was her devotion to Petra. It was almost fanatical, more than just a simple crush. She worried that it would get her killed, or worse, get both of them killed. It was not uncommon for mercenaries to shack up with one another between missions, but in combat overt reliance could prove problematic. Sacrifices were necessary, and love often got in the way. This was what drove Petra to take a blow for her subordinate, and it was also why Amina had frozen up during their fight with the beast. Edelgard walked in slowly, kneeling next to Petra's bed and looking at Amina. Amina barely even noticed, with only an imperceptible shift of her body weight as a reaction. "How is she?" Edelgard asked. "She's stable." The reply was cold and curt. "Did Mercedes say she would be okay?" "Yes." There was a long pause. She didn't know what to say. How did she even? "Amina, are you ALRI-? Before she even had time to react, Amina's blade was at her throat. It was not her Kusarigama, but rather a vibroblade that had not been switched on. Her neck was exposed since she was still in that demmed red dress, and she found herself cursing her carelessness. Her hand instinctively moved toward her thigh, to grab for her axe. She did not want to cut her subordinate down, but if it came down to her life or Amina's she would choose the former without hesitation. "I want to know," asked Amina calmly, "why the fuck we were down there? And what the hell was that thing?" "Oh. Not so calm after all." Her breathing was heavy and forceful, as if her rage left her bursting at the seams. She always knew that Amina could be a bit temperamental, but this was a little over the line. Edelgard sighed. "I'm sorry." "Sorry? Vitus is dead." Petra's, she choked a little. "For what it's worth, I didn't know." Which was the truth, in a sense. "I just came back from strangling Yuri for giving us the job." "The bartender? Well, he tipped us off, didn't he? I suppose you probably should have your knife at his throat instead of mine." She glanced downward at the steel blade and the calloused head that held it without any hesitation. The blade didn't move. Damn. It was worth a try. Edelgard cleared her throat. Ahem. Well, we were meant to investigate a laboratory. The last thing any of us expected was a demmed science experiment running around eating people. I thought we were going up against enforcers. I thought wrong. Amina nodded. And? That's it. She heard an audible groan. I can't fucking believe that we got jumped by an honest-to-God dinosaur. And it killed. A dinosaur wouldn't do that, she replied. That was something else. And if I knew exactly what it was, I would tell you. All I know is that it was probably human at one point. Edelgard shrugged her shoulders. She was getting tired of having a blade at her throat. All it took was to simply shift her weight to one side and snap the dagger away, and then just maybe she could get her hands around her neck. A long pause. Then, Amina simply sighed, taking the blade away from Edelgard's throat and sheathing it with a fwish. She stared at her, revealing a blank expression marred by a subtle sadness. Her body slumped back into her chair, which rocked back gently. It's such a demmed mess. And yet, even after all that, I can't really blame you. You and Petra fight for the same cause. And it's the magistrate's fault she's lying here in Vitus's. Amina paused, suddenly taking a very keen interest in the wall behind Edelgard as she merely stared in silence. She shook her head solemnly. I suppose you're going to throw me out of here after that little stunt. So go ahead. She motioned towards the door, which was the only way out. Edelgard instinctively raised an eyebrow, even if no one could see it. And why would I do that? I just threatened your life. The vibroblade wasn't on, Edelgard pointed out. And I probably would have still won. Amina took an e-cig out of her coat pocket and took a long drag, before exhaling dramatically. Figures. She blew the smoke away from the two of them. I'm not going to punish you just because you have a conscience. And besides, I just did the same thing to Yuri. She recalled the fact that she had almost choked out the bartender before her brain got the better of her. Amina probably could get a pass, considering it was technically Edelgard's fault that things had devolved into a complete mess. So the Queen of Flames is a big softy after all. Good to know. And there it was. A stupid grin crossed Amina's face, as Edelgard's mouth twitched in annoyance. Shut up. It was as if she was trying to push her buttons. But Edelgard felt her expression soften slightly, as she remembered another reason why she was visiting. Her thoughts went to Vitus, who had been eaten in the process of subduing the monster and keeping it occupied. She shuddered. Did he have family? Her subordinate was staring off into the distance, as if recalling memories of another time and place. He had a wife and a kid. Estranged. He always mentioned that his kid would like me. Said something about how I was the kind of prickly that his kid was. Oh. Edelgard sighed. I should probably tell them. She moved her wrist to pull up her holodeck, but Amina reached across Petra to grab her wrist. Don't. It was strange, to feel the grip of someone who just pressed a knife to her throat. But it was a gentle grip, and only now did Edelgard's shoulders relax. And why is that? I already did, admitted Amina. Visited them in the afternoon. The wife said she was glad he was dead. But I could see the tears in her eyes. The kid was too young to understand where her daddy went. There was an awkward silence. Just the constant beeping of the monitor, and the labored breathing of Petra between the two of them, the covers rising up and down with every gasp. Edelgard didn't want to look across the bed at Amina, so she instead stared at her feet. She had never been good with dealing with grief. Once she had cried out all of her tears and still cried some more, she found herself feeling broken afterwards. Something was simply just gone. Edelgard wondered if as a young girl she had sobbed until she truly had ran out of tears, and thus she had lost the capacity to cry. She wondered how that boy would feel, growing up without a father like she had. And even if he hadn't been around anyway, it still might have been some consolation to know that he was somewhere beneath the stars, finding his own way in the world. But now Vitus was coming back in a coffin, and she dared not ask what was being shown at the funeral considering the fact that he was eaten. What really bothered her is that she knew she should have felt more guilty. And yet she didn't. It was just another body to add to the pile, more blood on her hands that were already permanently stained with crimson. How many more families would she leave with missing pieces? I suppose I'll have to talk with them about compensation. She put her head in her hands. At least Yuri agreed to keep them comfortable. I don't suppose I can do something as well. Amina's expression turned soft. I would expect no less from the Queen of Flames. Edelgard admittedly expected nothing from herself. Before leaving, she managed to get in a few words with Casper. He admitted that he was quite mad about his boss sitting on the sidelines while her men fought, until Bernie showed him the footage of what had happened above ground. He clapped Edelgard on the back hard enough to knock the wind out of her, muttered something about hogging all the glory, and said that he was gonna go visit Petra and Amina. It was a little past midnight and she sat in her personal study on the top floor of her house. Though it was covered in bookshelves, she had little time to read any of them, and most were from a local library who sold their collection to the highest bidder, which happened to be her. A small lamp illuminated her wooden desk, as piles of papers stacked up on her left and a set of hollow screens shone in the darkness on her right. Only some charts and maps decorated the wall. One was a map of Newfoundland, marking every district as it had been 20 years ago. Another was a map of the solar system and the planets that surrounded the Sun, along with orbit paths for some of the more notable satellites and celestial bodies. She realized that her study was actually quite similar to Yuri's in arrangement, other than the easel laying off to her side. A few scattered paintings laid off to the side, and she wondered if she would ever have time to paint again. Edelgard admittedly wasn't the greatest artist of her time, but it was an experience dotting the canvas with her emotions and feelings. It took her mind off things at the very least. A hollow projector built into the desk overlaid the text of The Life and Death of Ceros on its wooden surface, as any imperfections in the wood were smoothed over by light to give the appearance of a perfectly flat surface. The book itself was unremarkable, and it was in the same language that Edelgard had seen before on the tank containing Project Cethlean. Old Fodlani. Or more accurately, Old Fodlani. It was a language that had not been used since the days of the... Edelgard paused. The Great War. The calendar had started after the victory of Nemesis on the Tailtean Plains, but who or what he was fighting was lost to history. Lost to history was a technical term, most of it was scorched when Fodlan was raised in the Unification War. But some documents and relics still remained, even if most of them were under the Empire's careful eye. Edelgard had heard stories about those who pried and dug too deep, only to disappear. She had an inkling that they were not being taken to become historians. Bernadetta, she said over the comm link, how serious is the filter when it comes to any pre-calendar history? Bernie's face appeared on her screen. If I post anything dated from before the calendar, the filter is triggered. If I post the word Ceros, the filter is triggered. And too many searches for the goddess triggers the filter. I still don't get how the filter finds these things, Edelgard said. She was referring to the fact that anything posted on the net found to be obscene or against Empire policy would be flagged within minutes, and appropriate punishment would be taken. It was why she was a bit afraid of being online too much, considering that anything that she said could technically be analyzed and tracked. It was also why when she did connect, she did so through enough host redirects and proxies to make tracing her impossible. Algorithms. I thought AI was banned. Algorithms aren't AI, dummy. I mean, boss. Bernie fidgeted a little in front of the camera. They're just programs that crawl the net searching for certain phrases and trigger words, and that combined with a context analyzing framework does a pretty good job at finding stuff. And that stuff is just ones and zeros. No brain needed. So why don't we have one? Oh, of course we have one. What do you think I use to search stuff? Your hands. Bernie ignored that comment. Stupid Edelgard, she huffed, and the connection cut. Edelgard went back to looking at the pages. Yuri had told her that it was a copy of a copy of a copy. The original book had been hardbound and handwritten, and it must have been reproduced during medieval times, when knights and lords still ruled the land. Something about that seemed oddly familiar yet intriguing, and Edelgard took a mental note of that. A copy of it must have been preserved for hundreds of years, and somehow survived the atomics that nearly glassed the surface of Fodlan. Though many of the pages were tattered and ink had bled enough to ruin the text, some of the pages were still relatively intact. The current translation was the work of one Gorlin Schmidt, an archivist who had passed 20 years ago that she had never heard of. Attached to it was a little scribbled note from Yuri that said incomplete. Though she wondered if other copies were out there or even other translations, she supposed that anybody carrying such a book might have been thrown in prison or made to vanish. After all, the person called Ceros clearly had been a sore spot for the Empire, which was why it was on the filter. Daughter of the goddess, she read out loud. Edelgard decided that a little bit of focus might help. From a drawer she pulled out a small case that contained a pair of black glasses. She blew dust off of the lenses, wiping it on her shirt, and put them on. They were low-tech, and Edelgard had not needed glasses ever since her confinement. But they were her mother's, and so she dusted them off whenever she wanted to focus. When she wore them it was as if a part of her mother read along with her. Damn. No matter how much Bernie fretted, it was impossible to get the computer to recognize the text or the translation. She thought about using an external database to cross-reference symbols, but any data uploaded might trip the filter if it contained certain phrases. Even for a scanned document the translation was nearly impossible to read, as if the data had been corrupted. The words were gibberish, broken up only by a few phrases and sentences that made sense. Ah! It would take a linguist to make sense of this. Or a cryptographer. Though to find one that was both loyal and discreet might take a while. And though Edelgard considered her own mind as sharp, it would take too much time to decipher the whole thing. And time was a luxury she did not have much of. Nabatean. Sard. Zanar, or was that Zanad? No. Zanado. Zanado. The Red Canyon. Where it all began. Why is the canyon red? Ferdinand asked. The horses stopped for a brief moment, as the professor pondered the question. For a second Edelgard thought that she was conversing with herself, her facial expressions betraying a hidden argument in her own mind. Sometimes she got like that, drifting off into space even during their conversations. The rock is being red, was Petra's answer. But no rock would be this shade, he mused. Maybe it's blood, said Casper. You know, like a dragon died here or something. BL blood. Eek, whispered Bernadetta. How big was that dragon? But what blood could stain an entire canyon for 1,000 years? A veritable ocean of blood would do it. But from what? It wasn't called the Red Canyon for nothing, and if the Black Eagles weren't hunting down bandits she might have taken some time to go sightseeing. After all, it was a place of natural beauty. But the color was just so. Come on, students. Let's not waste any more time, interrupted the professor. She brought the reins of her horse up and brought it into a gallop, and the class rode on. Edelgard simply swallowed her unease and followed, but she couldn't help but wonder about what had happened here. She would later give the Red Canyon a fresh coat of paint with the blood of bandits. Edelgard swore out loud. Damned flashbacks. Could they even be called flashbacks? So she had been to this Zanata before. It was red. And it was a canyon. Great. She pressed her palms to her temples. A lot of information to work off of. She kept reading the little bits of information out. The Sword of Ceros, she muttered. The gifts of the goddess. And she was not sure what the next word meant, but she could guess as to its meaning. Forsaken, she enunciated. Forsaken. Not sure why Schmidt didn't translate that, but altogether it painted a decent picture. The gifts of the goddess have forsaken us, and then she paused. Or does it mean we have forsaken the gifts of the goddess? She scribbled a note in the margins with a stylus. Vague meaning? Perhaps intentional? What did they mean by that? Edelgard flipped the page over. The scanned page was nearly completely soaked in a reddish liquid that had turned brown over the years. It would have been disgusting had it not been for the fact that she wasn't the one with the physical book. That would be Yuri. And she supposed that after all this time it was completely dry anyway. Most of the text was completely ruined except for a single paragraph. Edelgard traced the line with her index finger, symbol by symbol. It was too long for her to read phonetically, so she looked on the right side of her screen for the translation. Saint Ceros was slain in battle by the usurper Nemesis, she read to no one in particular. As she was struck down she cursed him and his descendants, damning the world that they would live in. Her last words were a desperate cry for her mother, the goddess. Goddess. There were believers, of course. None of the churches in the present era had lasted more than a few hundred years, and most of the religious documents of the old era were destroyed. Whether that was on purpose she did not understand. But most of them were simply fables, passed on from the days of yore. Those who claimed to hear the voice of the goddess would be claimed as saints, but few had revelations that were worthy of real attention. The only thing that all of the churches agreed on was that the goddess was very, very, dead. And even the historians of the empire admitted to her existence once upon a time. No matter how much they had tried to scrub the world of her memory, for some strange reason people simply believed in her. But whether or not she was an actual goddess was the real question. And that was a question of faith. Who was this Ceros woman, anyway? And what exactly made her a saint? As Edelgard moved to turn the page, a dim memory came to mind. By order of the Adrestian Emperor, Edelgard von Hresvelg, the Empire hereby declares war on the Church of Ceros. Those words would ring out across the land, upon both whispered lips and booming voices. And they would plunge Fodlan into war. It wasn't much of a memory, but she could almost taste those words on her lips. She had ordered that decree, and damned thousands of men as a result. But now she understood part of the puzzle, especially from the fact that a Church of Ceros even existed in that world. Edelgard stared at her jotted notes and tried to make sense of what she knew. Magic, not technology. Crests, power of the blood. A beautiful professor. Flane and Project Sethline. A church of Ceros. Not Nemesis. She was still no closer to the truth. But at least she understood more of what she was remembering. They were memories, perhaps of a possible future or a past that never was. They were incompatible with the history that she knew all too well, and the oldest discrepancy was from the Great War. From what she had read, Nemesis had killed Ceros on the field of battle. And yet it felt so wrong, as if it should have been the other way around. She scribbled down another note. Victory for Ceros, change in history. It would explain the lack of a god-emperor in her memories, and why there was a church dedicated to a saint the magistrate refused to even acknowledge. But it did not explain all of the discrepancies. Why her memories were of medieval times, knights clad in the armor of old and riding horses. It did not explain why magic coursed through the very air of her memories, healing wounds, and raising the battlefield with pure power. It also did not explain why she was warring against a church. If there was one thing Edelgard hated in the world, it was a puzzle with missing pieces. And there were too many holes to even entertain a possible solution for her phantom memories. She slammed her fist on the table, just enough for it to shake but not enough to punch a hole in it like her last desk. The hollow screen flickered lightly. It was frustrating. But at least she had some clues, and that was enough to go off of for now. With a wave of her right hand, she pushed The Life and Death of Saint Ceros away along with her notes, marking a small note to find a linguist to make a full translation. Edelgard then reached into the pile of paperwork on the front of her desk, pulling out a manila folder that had been cleaned but still had telltale signs that it had once been stained with blood. Amini had given it to her after their encounter. It was on Petra when she was struck by the beast, and so it fell to Edelgard to make sense of it. She opened it carefully. It was a series of complex scientific diagrams and chemistry formulas that she did not understand. The words were technical enough that she recognized them, but when put together made no sense to her. She probably would have preferred deciphering the old Fodlani of the previous text rather than try to wrap her head around what was inside the folder. Nabatean heteromorphic fluid analysis inconclusive. 200 mg sulfur dioxide applied to tissue sample. Transmutation. Structural integrity maintained in spite of adverse chemical reaction. Polysaccharides cleaved isomer group resulting in Ross hydron degradation. Oh, she thought dimly. Of course it was an experiment log of some sorts. Or maybe just a scientific paper, though she doubted that anything found in that laboratory would hold up under peer review or an ethics committee. She just wished that it was written in a language that she could actually understand. The next sheet of paper was a little more legible. Rows of names and numbers cascaded down in black ink, and as she read each entry grew more horrifying than the last. Denir Mikmos. 40%. Complete loss of sanity. Terminated. Venice von Engel. 15%. Uncontrollable bone growth. Terminated. Ika Ross. 32%. Additional limb sprouted. Harvested. Ophelia Daphne. 34%. Exsanguination through eyes. Terminated. Constance von Novelli. 55%. Successful implantation of cell matrix. In progress. Emil, surname unknown. 60%. Uncontrollable bloodlust. Lost. Edelgard von Hresvelg. 85%. Beyond threshold. Terminated. The list continued down the paper, as she silently read the names of every experiment. No. They weren't experiments. They were people. They had loving families, hopes and dreams, things that they could have done but never had the chance to. She recognized some of the names. Daphne. Novelli. Engel. So they had been kidnapping children, even from the rich and powerful, no doubt to guarantee their support in the future. Or perhaps it was a warning to their families, a reminder that the magistrate was the true power behind the shadows. And though they had wealth beyond measure, true power did not reside in buckets of credits. Edelgard had expected to see her name somewhere on it, but seeing von Hresvelg on there made her stomach turn in an odd way. Her entire bloodline was reduced to nothing but a name, a number, and a strangle proclamation that she was beyond the threshold. What threshold were they referring to? And the 85% meant something. It was the highest number there. She wondered dimly if it referred to a chance of success, or some measure of compatibility. And then there was the issue of her apparent termination. She hoped that she would stay dead to the magistrate for as long as she possibly could. It was only a matter of when they found out, and a living Hresvelg was a risk that they could not allow. But for the time being, Edelgard von Hresvelg was dead both legally and emotionally. Another piece of the puzzle. She would have to look into each of the cases, or at least hire someone to do so and find out what happened to each and every one of them. She groaned to no one in particular, resting the side of her head on her left hand. Child experimentation. And what was a Nabatean? Thoughts swirled in her mind, as she struggled to keep her focus. That was enough of that for today, she mused. Edelgard gingerly placed the manila folder onto the stack and continued on, as the next documents were case files of those who wanted to join her merry band of sellswords. Then her operating budget, then a request from a minor politician, and she kept reading on, sorting through more papers. Perhaps reading would serve as a distraction from her strange memories and the experiments that marked the end of her childhood. Her eyes glazed over as she read, and soon she slumped over on her desk in sleep. It was only when the sun got into her eyes and the birds started chirping that Edelgard awoke, cold and shivering. She did not remember much of her dream. Only a song, sung in a beautiful voice she could not place. In time's glow, see the glow of flames ever burning bright. On the swift river's drift, broken memories alight. Check the description for the links to the author.